Picture a kingdom of impossible beauty, where silver leaves catch the sunlight and the very air hums with ancient magic. For centuries, the elven realms stood as a testament to grace and harmony, their splendor so enduring it seemed etched into the fabric of the world itself. But even the most radiant light can cast deep shadows, and the greatest strength often hides the most fragile core. This is not just a story of kingdoms and crowns. It is a tale of quiet discoveries and hidden fractures, of one person's choice to look closer when everyone else looked away. And it all began with something as simple and as terrifying as a single root beginning to rot. High Mage Elowen of the Sunstone Spire was a guardian of that beauty, a keeper of the Lumina Tree, whose roots pulsed with the heart of elven magic. One day, she noticed something others had missed, a faint, unnatural decay where there should have been only life. It was subtle, a whisper where there should have been a song. Fearful of igniting panic in a realm that had known nothing but peace, she chose to investigate alone. That decision, made in solitude and silence, would unravel everything. What she found was not age or chance, but a deliberate sickness, a hidden rot festering beneath the glittering surface of their world. And in that moment, the quiet war began. Wherever you are in the world right now, whether you're listening beneath a midday sun or drifting into evening, we'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and what does your own corner of the world look like as you join us? Let us know in the comments below, because stories like these remind us that truth often reveals itself in the stillest hours, in the choices we make when no one else is watching. This is the story of how the Elven Kingdoms fell apart, not with a roar, but with a whisper. It's a journey into the spaces between perfection and truth, between what is seen and what is feared. And it asks a question that echoes far beyond any fantasy. What happens when the beauty we cherish begins to hide the cracks we refuse to see? Alone in the cool, quiet chamber that cradled the Lumina Tree's immense roots, Elowen extended her hands, her fingertips barely grazing the gnarled, silver bark. A soft, golden light emanated from her palms, a diagnostic spell so subtle it was little more than a magical whisper, designed to listen rather than to command. She expected to hear the familiar, resonant hum of pure life, the song that had sustained her people for millennia. Instead, the magic returned a discordant note, a chilling silence that felt like a void. The decay wasn't a result of age or some unlucky blight. It was a precise, methodical unraveling. This was no accident. Each corrupted fiber pulsed with a faint, foreign signature, a magical corrosion so deliberate it felt like a calculated act of violence against the very soul of their world. Her breath caught in her throat. This was sabotage. The weight of that single word pressed down on her, immense and terrifying. To speak it aloud in the Sunstone Spire would be to shatter a peace that had lasted for generations. She could go to the royal court right now, present her horrifying discovery to King Thuron and his advisors, and set the entire machinery of the Elven Kingdom into motion. But what if she was wrong? What if her fear was clouding her interpretation of the delicate magic? The evidence, while chilling to her, was still subtle. She could already hear the dismissive voices of senior mages who prized tradition above all, who would call it an anomaly, a natural fluctuation, not worth disrupting centuries of tranquility for. And worse, What if the saboteur was among them? To reveal her knowledge now could alert the enemy, giving them time to cover their tracks or strike more decisively. Every second she spent here, tracing the malignant magic, she was risking discovery. The very air around her felt watchful, the shadows between the roots seeming to deepen with hidden intent. Her choice was agonizing: sound the alarm and potentially ignite a panic based on incomplete proof, or continue this investigation alone, armed only with her skill and her growing dread, hoping to find a name, a motive, anything concrete before the rot spread too far. In the profound silence of the sacred chamber, High Mage Elowen made her choice. She withdrew her magic, letting the gentle light fade from her hands, and decided to walk a path of shadows. It was a decision that would plant the first, fragile seed of distrust, not just in the court, but within her own heart. For days, Elowen worked in secret, gathering every shred of evidence she could find. She bottled traces of the corrosive magic in crystal phials, pressed samples of the withered root into enchanted silk, and meticulously documented the precise, unnatural pattern of the decay. When she finally requested an audience with King Thuron, her heart was a drum against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She entered the council chamber, a vast hall of living wood and flowing water, where the most esteemed figures of the realm were gathered. Sunlight streamed through the crystalline ceiling, illuminating the king's thoughtful face and the skeptical expressions of his advisors. With a calm she did not feel, Elowen laid out her discovery. She spoke of the silent corrosion, the foreign magic, the undeniable signs of a targeted attack on their most vital source of power. She presented her files and her parchments, her voice clear and measured in the hushed room. The silence that followed was heavier than any she had known in the roots of the Lumina Tree. It was High Lord Valerius, master of traditions, who broke it. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm, layered with the weight of centuries of precedent. High Mage Elowen, he began, your dedication to your duties is, as always, beyond reproach. Yet, what you interpret as malice could simply be a fluctuation we do not yet understand. The Lumina Tree is ancient beyond our full comprehension. Its rhythms are its own. Another advisor, Lady Sariel, nodded in agreement. To speak of sabotage is to speak of a threat from within our own ranks. We have known nothing but peace for 1,000 years. To sow such suspicion based on whispers in the roots is a dangerous path. It is the duty of the crown to promote stability, not panic. One by one, the council members echoed these sentiments. Her evidence, so terrifyingly clear to her, was dismissed as the overcaution of a mage who spent too much time in solitude, who saw shadows where there was only shifting light. They valued the unbroken tradition of their peace above the unsettling possibility of its fracture. King Thuron listened to all, his gaze thoughtful, but ultimately, he sided with the council's consensus. Continue your vigilant watch, Elowen, he said, his tone final, but do so without alarming the citadel. We must trust in the strength of our realm and the bonds that hold us. Dismissed, Elowen walked from the chamber not with anger, but with a cold, hollow feeling of isolation. The glittering halls of the palace, once a source of comfort and belonging, now felt like a gilded cage. Her truth had been declared a fantasy. The very institution meant to protect the kingdom had become a barrier to its defense. She stood at a crossroads as stark as any she had ever faced. She could obey the king's command, return to the Sunstone Spire, and watch silently as the rot she knew was there continue to spread, unchallenged and unseen by those who refused to look. Or she could defy the crown's direct order. She could step outside the circle of light and privilege into the dimmer, less trusted corners of the world to seek help from those the court had cast out. It was a choice between her duty to her position and her duty to her people. The weight of that decision was immense, for choosing to act alone would brand her a rogue, an outsider in her own home. Yet, as she felt the faint, persistent echo of the decay through the palace's very stones, she knew the stakes were too high to surrender. The rejection she faced in that council chamber didn't end her quest. It simply forced it onto a new, far more dangerous path, one that led away from the throne and toward the one person whose knowledge was as deep as his disgrace. The polished halls of the Sunstone Spire felt like a prison of polished lies after the council's dismissal. Every smiling courtier, every serene tapestry depicting eternal peace, now seemed like a deliberate act of ignorance. The rot was real. She had felt its cold, silent hunger, and if the crown would not see it, she would have to find eyes that could. This realization led her down forgotten staircases and through the lesser-used corridors of the citadel to a door that was little more than an afterthought in the grand architecture. This was the entrance to the royal archives, but not the celebrated main halls. This was the repository for the knowledge the kingdom had chosen to forget. The air inside was thick with the scent of old parchment and undisturbed dust. Light struggled through high, grimy windows, illuminating floating motes that danced like forgotten memories. And there, surrounded by precarious towers of scrolls and texts, deemed too dangerous or disruptive for common study, was Kalin. He was not what she had expected. She had heard tales of a raving heretic, a madman who challenged the foundations of their society. The man before her, however, had eyes of sharp, patient intelligence, though shadowed by years of isolation. He looked up from his work, not with surprise, but with a weary recognition. "High Mage Elowen," he said, his voice dry as the pages around him. "The court must be truly desperate to send you to my library." Elowen felt a flush of shame, realizing her presence alone confirmed his long-held warnings. She laid out her findings without the courtly pretense, showing him the corrupted root samples and the crystal files holding the faint echo of the corrosive magic. She spoke of the council's dismissal, of their fear of shattering the perfect image of their world. Kalin listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he let out a soft, humorless laugh. They called it a fluctuation, a natural rhythm. Of course they did. It is easier to believe the world is dying than to admit you have been blind. He rose and moved deeper into the gloom of the archive, motioning for her to follow. What you have found is no simple sabotage. It is a ghost, a magic our ancestors were so terrified of they scrubbed its name from every official record. They called it the Weeping. He led her to a reading stand where a fragile, unbound manuscript lay open. The script was an archaic form of Elvish, the illustrations depicting not glorious battles or radiant trees, but landscapes fading into gray, silent despair. The weeping does not destroy with fire or force, Kalin explained, his finger tracing a diagram of a tree whose roots were turning to dust. It consumes connection. It severs the magical bonds between living things, leaving only hollow silence in its wake. It is a hunger that feeds on life itself, leaving behind a perfect, beautiful shell that is utterly dead inside. This was the heresy that had exiled him, not a desire to destroy their world, but an insistence on remembering the vulnerabilities it was built upon. His aid, however, would not come without a price. "I will help you," he said, his gaze locking with hers, "but on one condition. You do not get to use me as a key to unlock this mystery, and then toss me back into this dark corner. My knowledge has kept me prisoner for decades. If I help you save this kingdom that cast me out, you will ensure my voice is heard in whatever comes after. You will make them remember what they chose to forget." The condition hung in the dusty air between them. To accept was to formally ally herself with a man the crown had branded a traitor to their ideal of perfection. It was a betrayal of the very court she still, in her heart, served. But looking at the ancient text, seeing the chillingly accurate description of the decay she had witnessed, she knew she had no other choice. Trusting the untrustworthy was her only path forward. With a tense nod, she agreed. The partnership, forged in mutual need and profound skepticism, immediately bore fruit. Combining Elowen's fresh evidence with Kalin's deep historical knowledge, they began to cross-reference the locations of the first signs of decay. A pattern emerged, one that sent a new kind of chill down Elowen's spine. The disturbances were not centered on the capital or the Lumina Tree itself. They were clustered in the outlying territories, the Silverwood Marches, the Whispering Glens, the sun-kissed reaches regions that had long complained of being neglected by the central court. Their resources used to maintain the capital's brilliance, while their own needs were ignored. The weeping was not striking at the heart of the kingdom first. It was meticulously severing its limbs, isolating the core, and it was doing so by exploiting the quiet resentments and forgotten corners of their own world. They weren't just hunting a magical plague, they were tracing the footsteps of a predator that knew their history better than they did. The journey to the Silverwood Marches was a descent from the gilded heart of the kingdom into its fading edges. For Elowen, who had spent centuries within the radiant energy of the Sunstone Spire, the change in the air was palpable, a gradual dimming of the world's vibrant song. The forests here were older, wilder, the ancient trees standing like silent, weary sentinels. Kalin moved through this landscape with a familiarity that surprised her, his exile having made him more at home in the forgotten places than in the polished centers of power. He pointed out the signs she, in her isolation, had missed. The way certain flowers bloomed a shade too pale, the unusual quiet where the chatter of woodland spirits should have been. It was a slow, quiet dying, happening just beyond the periphery of the court's attention. When they finally reached the heart of the Silverwood, the sight that greeted them was far worse than Elowen had feared. It wasn't just a single root or a patch of corrupted earth. Entire groves of moon willows, their silver leaves once a symbol of the borderland's gentle strength, stood skeletal and gray. Their bark was brittle to the touch, crumbling away to reveal a hollow, ashen core. The air itself felt thin, drained of magic, carrying the faint, sweet scent of decay. This was not a subtle whisper of rot anymore. It was a scream of neglect, and the most chilling part of it all was the profound silence. There were no alarms ringing, no frantic messages sent to the capital, no local guardians standing vigil over the blight. The sentinels assigned to this region, elite elves sworn to protect these lands, were utterly unaware. The decay had woven itself so seamlessly into the background of their duties that it had become invisible to them. The perfect crime was not a violent attack, but a patient, invisible erosion. Driven by a rising panic, Elowen went directly to the nearest Wardstone, a towering monolith of obsidian, etched with glowing runes that should have been pulsing with protective energy. These stones formed an invisible barrier around the kingdom, a net of power that kept dark forces at bay and nurtured the life within. She placed her hands upon its cool surface, expecting to feel the familiar, reassuring hum. Instead, she felt a dissonant vibration, a current of energy that was twisted and wrong. Kalin joined her, his own magical senses, honed by decades of studying corrupted texts, probing deeper. His face grew grim. "They haven't broken the ward," he murmured, his voice tight. "That would have triggered every alarm from here to the king's throne. They've repurposed it." This was the masterstroke of the sabotage. Someone with immense skill and intimate knowledge of their magical infrastructure had not destroyed the protective barrier, but had subtly redirected its flow. The energy meant to sustain life and provide defense was being siphoned away, channeled into the relentless spread of the weeping. The Wardstones were not failing. They were being turned into weapons against the very land they were built to protect. The sheer audacity and precision of it left Elowen breathless. This was not the work of some external monster or a rogue outcast. This required a deep, insider's understanding of elven high magic. The enemy was not at the gates. They were in the workshop, in the library, in the council chamber. The rot was internal. This terrifying revelation presented her with an impossible choice, right there at the corrupted Wardstone. Her every instinct as a high mage screamed at her to fix it. She had the knowledge and the power to realign the energy flows, to restore the ward's protective purpose, and perhaps even slow the decay in this region. It would be a tangible victory, a chance to save these withering groves, but doing so would also be like cutting a single thread on a vast, tangled web. It would alert the saboteur that their work had been discovered. They would cover their tracks, change their methods, and vanish deeper into the shadows, making it impossible to trace the magic back to its source. The other option was to leave it, to let the sickness continue its spread, to allow more of the silverwood to die, all for the chance to follow the magical trail back to its origin point within the kingdom's trusted ranks. It was a choice between immediate, compassionate action and strategic, cold patience, between saving a part of the whole now or risking everything for a chance to save it all later. Her hand hovered over the Wardstone's runes, trembling with the weight of the decision. To walk away from a thing she could fix felt like a betrayal of her deepest vows. But to fix it might be the greatest betrayal of all. With a heart heavy with grief for the dying forest, she made her choice. She withdrew her hand, leaving the corruption in place, and turned to Kalin. Their path was no longer about finding a sickness. It was about hunting the healer who had chosen to become the plague. Back in the dusty seclusion of the forgotten archives, surrounded by the ghosts of discarded knowledge, Kalin spread the fragile pieces of the prophecy before them. The parchment was so old it felt like solidified air, threatening to crumble at a touch. The script was a hybrid of languages, some so ancient even Elowen struggled with their meanings, as if the original writer had been trying to hide the truth, even as they recorded it. Kalin's fingers, stained with ink and dust, moved with a delicate reverence, piecing together fragments like a man solving a puzzle that held the weight of the world. "It's not a prediction of invasion or some great monster," he muttered, his voice a low hum in the silent room. "The texts all speak of a sickness of the spirit, not the sword." A failure from within. He traced a series of interlocking runes that formed a symbol Elowen recognized with a jolt. It was a stylized depiction of the Lumina Tree, but with its roots blackened and unraveling. "Here," he said, his tone grimly triumphant. "The line is broken in 3 places, but the core of it is clear. The golden age shall not end by claw or flame, but by the silent hand. And the fall begins where trust is rotted from within." The phrase hung in the air between them, cold and absolute. Trust rotted from within. It was no longer a theory or a suspicion. It was a diagnosis, centuries old, describing the exact sickness now infecting their world. This wasn't just about a magical attack. It was an ideological one. The sabotage, the redirected wardstones, the weeping itself, it was all a symptom. The cause was a profound, festering belief that the Elven Kingdoms had become a beautiful corpse, that their centuries of peace were not a triumph, but a stagnation, a refusal to evolve, to adapt, to truly live. The perfection the court fought so hard to protect was, in the eyes of this hidden faction, their greatest failure. They weren't trying to conquer the kingdom. They believed they were trying to save it, even if that meant burning its glorious, stagnant form to the ground, so something new could grow from the ashes. This realization struck Elowen with a force that was both intellectual and deeply personal. For her entire life, loyalty had been a simple, clear path. Serve the king, protect the Lumina Tree, uphold the traditions that guaranteed their peace. Now, that path forked into a treacherous maze. Could loyalty mean blindly defending a system that was so brittle it could be shattered from the inside? Or did true loyalty demand questioning that very system, even if it meant aligning, in spirit, with those the crown called enemies? She looked at the prophecy, then in her mind's eye, she saw the withering groves of the Silverwood marches, the hollowed-out sentinels, the court's dismissive smiles. The hidden faction, whoever they were, had a point. The kingdom was fragile. Its beauty was hiding deep flaws. To acknowledge that truth felt like a betrayal in itself. This internal conflict crystallized into an immediate, terrifying choice. They now possessed not just evidence of a magical crime, but an understanding of its motive. She could take this prophecy to King Thuron. She could reveal the entire, horrifying truth, that the threat came from a group of elves who believed his reign was a failure, that their golden age was a gilded cage. But what would that achieve? Would it unite the court against a common enemy, or would it act like a spark in a room full of kindling? It would confirm every paranoid fear, turn advisor against advisor, family against family. It would legitimize the very distrust the prophecy warned of, potentially triggering the exact chaos the Saboteurs wanted, a chaos from which only a strong new order could emerge. Her alternative was to hold this devastating knowledge close, to keep working in the shadows with Kalin, trying to identify the faction before their ideology could spread further. But silence was a gamble. Every day she stayed quiet was another day the rot spread. Another day the faction could recruit more disillusioned elves who saw no other way to force change. The stakes were no longer about saving a tree or even a forest. They were about the soul of the elven people. The quiet war had just become a battle of ideas, and Elowen stood at its center, torn between the duty she had always known and a truth she could no longer ignore. The shadows in the archive seemed to deepen around them, feeling less like a refuge and more like a premonition of the division to come. They weren't just hunting saboteurs anymore. They were navigating the fault lines of a civilization beginning to crack under the weight of its own perfect image. Returning to the Sunstone Spire felt like stepping onto a battlefield disguised as a ballroom. The air, once filled with the gentle murmur of diplomacy and magic, now crackled with a new, sharp energy. Elowen entered the council chamber with Kalin's translated prophecy carefully etched onto a fresh scroll, a sliver of hard-won truth she hoped would finally unite them. She presented her case not as a lone mage, but with the weight of forgotten history, explaining how the decay was not mere sabotage, but a symptom of a deeper ideological sickness, a belief that the kingdom's golden age had become a prison of stagnation. For a single, fleeting moment, there was a unified silence, a shared horror at the prophecy's words. Then the fractures appeared. Lord Valerius, master of traditions, seized upon the prophecy not as a warning, but as a weapon. This rotting from within confirms our greatest fears, he declared, his voice ringing with accusation. It is the outlying regions, with their constant demands and their disregard for our ancient ways, that poison our unity. Their resentment has festered into this weeping. We must reinforce the capital's defenses and bring the border lords to heel before their discontent destroys us all. In direct opposition, Lady Sariel, who had long advocated for greater regional autonomy, saw a different enemy. This is the arrogance of the central court, made manifest. She countered, her tone icy. The prophecy speaks of trust rotted by those in power. It is our neglect, our hoarding of the Lumina's magic for our own spires and gardens, that has bred this despair in the forgotten realms. To assume the threat comes from the outside is to ignore the decay in our own heart. What Elowen had brought as a key to understanding was shattered and used as a wedge. Allies of decades became instant rivals, each faction twisting the ancient words to validate their long-held grievances and justify their own power grabs. The council chamber, a place meant for reasoned debate, devolved into a cacophony of fear and accusation. King Thuron watched the division unfold, his expression a mask of pained authority. He saw not a path to a solution, but the rapid unraveling of the very fabric of his realm. The truth Elowen presented, instead of providing clarity, had become the spark that threatened to ignite a civil war. In that moment, his duty was not to investigate a mystery, but to prevent an immediate explosion. His voice, when it finally cut through the din, was heavy with finality. Enough, he commanded, and the room fell silent. This speculation leads only to chaos. We will not tear ourselves apart based on the interpretations of an exiled scholar and a fragmented text. His gaze settled on Elowen, not with anger, but with a profound weariness. The investigation ends. Now, you will speak of this to no one. We will increase patrols and monitor the Lumina Tree, but we will not pursue phantoms that turn elf against elf. Our priority is stability. Is that understood? The order struck Elowen with the force of a physical blow. To halt now was to surrender, to condemn the dying forests and the corrupted wards to their fate. It was to obey a command given from a place of fear, a command that guaranteed the kingdom's eventual collapse. She stood at the precipice of the most defining choice of her life. Obedience meant returning to her spire, watching the decay spread through her scrying pools, and upholding a silence that felt like complicity. It meant honoring the king she had sworn to serve, even as his order doomed everything she had sworn to protect. The other path was unthinkable, outright disobedience. To continue the investigation in secret would make her a rogue agent, an outlaw in the very kingdom she was trying to save. It would mean betraying her king's direct command, risking not only her position and title, but potentially her life if she were discovered. As she stood there, the heated arguments of the faction leaders still echoing in the hall, she made her choice. The king's order, given to preserve a fragile peace, was itself a symptom of the very stagnation the prophecy described. True loyalty, she realized, was not blind obedience to a failing command. It was loyalty to the people, to the land, to the future. With a quiet nod that Thuron would interpret as acquiescence, she accepted his decree, but behind her calm expression, a resolve hardened. The path of the loyal subject was closed to her. The only path that remained was the shadowy, treacherous one of the covert rebel. She would disobey. She would continue, and she would do it completely alone, for now even the slightest misstep could mean not just failure, but being branded the very traitor she was hunting. The king's command to stand down echoed in her mind, a cage of duty she could no longer accept. Her official work had ended, but her true mission had only just begun, forcing her into the dimly lit corners of the citadel, where whispers held more power than proclamations. It was in one such shadowy alcove, listening to the hushed, frustrated conversations of junior mages and disgruntled artisans, that she first heard the name. It was spoken not with fear, but with a fervent, hopeful intensity. The Verdant Veil. They were not spoken of as saboteurs or terrorists, but as visionaries. They spoke of a renewal, a great cleansing that would wash away the stagnation of the court and allow a new, stronger elven people to rise from the ashes of the old. Their rhetoric was intoxicating, a siren song of purpose for those who felt the kingdom's beautiful traditions had become chains. But Elowen, her senses honed by the chilling silence of the weeping, heard the dissonant notes hidden within their harmonious promises. Their vision of renewal was built upon the very decay she was fighting. They spoke of the withering borderlands not as a tragedy to be reversed, but as a necessary pruning, a painful but essential step toward a more resilient future. They saw the Lumina trees suffering not as a wound to be healed, but as the death throes of a failed system. Their means were a direct mirror of the ends they claimed to despise: destruction in the name of creation, silence in the name of a new song. They were not healers. They were gardeners who believed the only way to save the forest was to set it on fire. This presented her with a perilous opportunity. A servant, his eyes alight with a newfound sense of belonging, let slip the location and time of an upcoming gathering, a hidden clearing in the less traveled western grove, under the cloak of twilight. To go there was to step into the lion's den, but the chance to see the enemy, to understand their structure and their reach, was a temptation she could not refuse. Disguising herself not with a glamour, which could be detected by other skilled mages, but with the humble robes of a groundskeeper and a hood pulled low, Elowen became a ghost, moving among them. As she slipped through the gathering crowd of elves from all walks of life, idealistic young scholars, weary soldiers, craftsmen whose talents were overlooked by the court, a cold dread settled in her stomach. This was not a small cotter of extremists. This was a movement. Their influence had spread like mycelium through the rich soil of the kingdom's discontent, connecting disparate souls with the common thread of disillusionment. The leader of the gathering was not a raving fanatic, but a figure of calm, compelling authority. He spoke of a world where magic was not hoarded by the elite in their spires, but shared by all. He painted a vivid picture of a society unshackled from the weight of 1,000 years of precedent, where innovation and growth were valued above preservation and beauty. His words were a masterful blend of truth and poison, acknowledging the very real failures Elowen herself had witnessed while offering a catastrophic, irreversible solution. He spoke of the weeping as a great unmaking, a necessary step before the great becoming. To hear the horrific decay she had battled framed as a sacred, purposeful act was enough to make her blood run cold. Her hand itched to unleash a binding spell, to reveal herself as a high mage and dismantle this entire seditious meeting in a blaze of authority. To expose them now would be a decisive strike. But a deeper, more strategic instinct held her back. Taking down one cell would be like cutting the head off a hydra. 2 more would grow in its place from the deep well of resentment they had tapped into. She knew she was looking at the symptom, not the source. Who was pulling the strings? Where were they getting the intricate magical knowledge to redirect the Wardstones and wield the weeping? To act now would be to pluck a leaf while the root continued to spread unseen beneath the soil. She had to stay hidden. She had to listen. She had to become one of them, just for a little while longer, to trace the infection back to its heart. This deception was a tightrope walk over a chasm. Every nod of agreement with their dangerous philosophy felt like a betrayal of her own soul. Every moment she spent in their midst increased the risk of her true identity being discovered, not by magic, but by a simple slip of the tongue, a too knowledgeable question, or the piercing gaze of someone who looked a little too closely at the hands of a supposed groundskeeper that were too clean, too steady, too accustomed to channeling immense power. She was playing a role that could cost her not just her life, but her very sense of self, all for a chance to gather the intelligence that might save the very people who now stood around her, nodding in fervent agreement with their own eventual destruction. The discovery of the Verdant Veil's growing influence was a cold, strategic problem. Infiltrating their meeting had been a calculated risk, a necessary step in a dangerous game. But what Elowen uncovered next was not a piece of strategic intelligence. It was a personal earthquake that threatened the very ground beneath her feet. While tracing the flow of corrupted magic from the western grove back toward the citadel, she expected to find a shadowy mastermind, a disgraced noble, or a fanatical mage. The magical signature she was following, however, led her to a familiar door in the officers' quarters, one she had visited countless times since they were children, learning to spar with wooden swords. It was the home of Captain Lyra, the formidable commander of the Sunstone Guard, her most trusted friend, and the one person she believed was as unwavering in her loyalty to the crown as Elowen herself. The evidence was not a smoking gun, but a collection of chilling details that formed an inescapable pattern. A rare blossom from the Western Grove, known to be a symbol of the Veil, was pressed inside a strategy book on Lyra's desk. Her patrol schedules, which Elowen discreetly checked, showed her repeatedly near the sites of early decay, right before the blight was discovered, not as a responder, but as an observer. Most damning of all was the faint, residual echo of the weeping's unique magical frequency, clinging to Lyra's ceremonial armor, a residue so subtle only a mage of Elowen's sensitivity, who knew exactly what to look for, could have detected it. This was not the work of an enemy spy. It was the quiet, agonizing betrayal of a sister-in-arms who had chosen a different path. Elowen could have gone directly to the king. She could have presented her findings and watched as the guards she once commanded arrested her oldest friend. It would have been the clean, logical choice, the duty of a high mage. But the thought was physically painful. This was Lyra, the fierce, brilliant elf who had stood by her through every trial, who understood the weight of command when no one else did. This betrayal was not born of malice. It was born of the same frustration and fear that had driven Elowen and herself to disobedience. Lyra had simply reached a different, more desperate conclusion. She saw the kingdom's rigidity not as a tradition to be questioned, but as a cage to be shattered. Her sympathy for the Verdant Veil was a twisted form of the same love for their people that fueled Elowen's own secret quest. The confrontation could not happen in the open. Elowen waited until dusk, when the corridors were quiet, and found Lyra alone on her balcony, overlooking the glittering spires of the capital. The scene was a painful parody of their countless shared evenings, talking of hopes and duties under the same stars. Elowen did not accuse. She simply held up the pressed blossom she had taken from the desk and spoke Lyra's name, her voice thick with a grief she had not felt even when facing the withering forests. The shock on Lyra's face was instant, followed not by denial, but by a weary, defiant resignation. "You weren't supposed to find out," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of its usual warmth. "I thought you, of all people, would understand. You see the decay. You feel the stagnation. How can you stand there and defend this?" She gestured at the beautiful, sleeping city below them. "We are polishing a statue that is already dust inside. The Verdant Veil doesn't want to destroy us. Elowen, they want to save us. They have the courage to do what the king will not." The conversation that followed was a brutal unraveling of a lifetime of trust. Lyra spoke of her frustration with sending guards to die protecting borders that the court ignored, of watching talented elves be passed over for promotions because they weren't from the right families, of feeling like a glorified sentinel for a paradise that only existed for a privileged few. The Veil's promise of a meritocracy, of a world reshaped by strength and vision rather than ancient bloodlines, had called to her deepest disillusionments. She believed the ends justify the means, even the horrific, silent violence of the weeping. She saw it as a painful, necessary surgery. To Elowen, it was a terminal disease. Now, Elowen stood on the precipice of an impossible choice that cut far deeper than any strategic decision. Turning Lyra in would be a clean, decisive act. It would remove a dangerous sympathizer from a position of power, and might even provide the king with the proof he needed to finally take the threat seriously. But it would also mean condemning her best friend to imprisonment or exile, shattering a bond that felt as fundamental to the kingdom as the Lumina Tree itself. It would be a victory that felt like a profound, personal defeat. The other path was infinitely harder and far more dangerous: to try and redeem her. To try and reach the loyal, brave elf she knew was buried beneath the layers of resentment and radical ideology. This meant continuing to hide her own investigation from the king, while attempting to deprogram a high-ranking officer of a movement she was infiltrating. It would require a level of trust that felt almost foolish, a gamble that Lyra's love for their people was stronger than her allegiance to a destructive new ideal. One misstep, one moment of failed persuasion, and Lyra could expose Elowen's own treasonous activities to the very faction she was trying to undermine. This painful rift between two friends who both believed they were saving their world was a perfect, heartbreaking mirror of the kingdom's larger fracture. It was no longer a conflict between clear-cut loyalists and rebels. It was a civil war of the spirit, where love for home could manifest as either fierce protection or violent renewal, where the same diagnosis could lead to two completely opposing cures. The trust that had once been the bedrock of Elowen's life was now a fissure running through its center, and the choice she made about Captain Lyra would not just determine her friend's fate, it would define what kind of leader and what kind of person she would become in this escalating shadow war. The rift with Lyra left a cold, hollow space where friendship had once been, a personal wound that mirrored the growing fractures in the kingdom itself. But there was no time to grieve. Every moment spent in inaction was another moment. The silent decay spread its invisible threads further through the heart of elven magic. Driven by a new, desperate urgency, Elowen and Kalin retreated to the deepest vault of the forgotten archives, a room so secluded even the dust seemed ancient and undisturbed. Here, surrounded by the ghostly knowledge of fallen empires and dead magic, they pooled their resources. Elowen brought her precise, first-hand experiences with the Weeping's corrosive signature, the chilling data she had gathered from the corrupted Wardstones and the withering Silverwood. Kalin brought the terrifying theoretical framework, the forbidden texts that spoke of artifacts and powers so dangerous their very names had been erased. For hours that bled into days, they worked in a feverish silence, cross-referencing magical frequencies with historical records, comparing the unique resonance of the Decay to descriptions of legendary objects lost to time. The answer, when it finally emerged from the chaos of scrolls and scrying crystals, was more horrifying than either of them had dared to imagine. It wasn't a spell or a simple weapon. The source of the corruption was the heart of Ethelgard, a legendary focusing crystal crafted at the dawn of their civilization. It was never meant to be a tool of war, but of creation, a divine instrument used by the first elves to weave the very magical foundations of their world, to harmonize the ley lines and give the Lumina Tree its form. It was thought destroyed in a cataclysm millennia ago, its power too immense, too primal to be safely contained. The texts described it not as a thing of evil, but of pure, unfiltered potential, a power that would magnify the intent of its wielder 1,000-fold. The sheer, terrifying implication of this left them both breathless. Someone hadn't created a weapon. They had found the most powerful instrument of creation their people had ever known and had corrupted it. They had poured their malice, their belief in necessary destruction, into a vessel designed to amplify energy, and in doing so, had turned a tool of life into an engine of absolute desolation. The weeping wasn't an attack. It was a perversion, a beautiful song played on a shattered instrument, producing only dissonance and silence, and the most chilling part of all was the location. According to Kalin's pieced-together maps and the directional flow of the corrupted energy Elowen had traced, the artifact wasn't hidden in some remote, desolate ruin. The magical trail led inward, not outward. It was emanating from directly beneath their feet. The heart of Ethelgard was hidden somewhere deep beneath the royal palace itself, in the labyrinthine foundations that predated the current city, a place of such symbolic power that its defilement was almost unthinkable. This changed everything. They weren't just hunting a saboteur, they were racing against an apocalyptic clock. The Lumina Tree wasn't simply being attacked, it was being systematically unraveled by a twisted reflection of its own original magic. Kalin theorized that the corruption was building toward a cascade failure, a point of no return where the tree's own immense life force would become the very energy that accelerates its complete dissolution, like a star collapsing into a black hole. They had days, perhaps only hours, to find it. But how does one find a single, hidden object in the most secure, most ancient, and most heavily warded complex in the entire kingdom? Conventional tracking spells would be detected instantly by the palace's own security webs. Scrying would be seen as an act of aggression. They had no authority to search, and every guard they passed could be a loyalist, a Veil sympathizer, or the mastermind himself. Their only option was an act of profound recklessness. Kalin, his face pale but determined, pointed to a section of a brittle, blood-red scroll. It detailed a long forbidden form of magic known as the Soul Thread. It was a tracking spell of immense power and even greater risk, banned not because it was dark, but because it was suicidal. Instead of sending out a tendril of magic to search, it required the caster to project a sliver of their own consciousness, their very life essence, into the magical currents of the world to follow the trail. It was like sending a part of your soul out as a bloodhound. The caster would be left physically vulnerable, their body in a trance-like state, completely defenseless. And the projected consciousness itself could be sensed by any skilled mage nearby, a bright flare in the spiritual realm that would scream their location and their intent to anyone looking for such things. It was the magical equivalent of shouting your plans in a silent hall full of enemies. To use it was to risk everything. If they were discovered while in the trance, they would be captured or killed without a fight. If the strain of the spell proved too much, the sliver of consciousness might not return, leaving the caster an empty shell. But the alternative was to stand by and watch their entire world die. The choice was between certain, gradual doom and a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. Without needing to discuss it further, they made their decision. Elowen, as the more powerful mage with the freshest connection to the corruption's signature, would cast the spell. Kalin would stand guard, his own knowledge of obscure wards, his only weapon to shield her vulnerable body, and hopefully mask the spiritual flare of her questing consciousness from any prying senses. In the oppressive silence of the archive, Elowen sat upon the cold stone floor, closing her eyes and beginning the intricate, dangerous chant. The air grew heavy as she poured her will into the spell, feeling a terrifying tearing sensation as a part of her very self was pulled away and sent falling down through the stones of the palace, following the siren song of decay back to its poisoned source. Above her, Kalin watched, his hands tracing frantic, silencing runes in the air, his eyes darting to the single door, knowing that their time, already short, was now measured in frantic, heart-pounding moments. Every second Elowen's spirit wandered the foundations was a second they risked discovery, and the attention they were drawing to themselves could prove to be a threat as immediate as the one they were racing to find. The atmosphere in the royal court had curdled from anxious deliberation into something far more brittle, a palpable, suffocating fear. King Thuron, a monarch who had always ruled with a contemplative grace, now sat upon his throne like a man besieged, the weight of his crown seeming to physically press down upon him. His most trusted advisors, the very same lords and ladies who had once dismissed Elowen's warnings, now crowded around him, their voices a sharp chorus of panic. They presented him with a single, stark solution, framed as the only path to safety: a complete and total lockdown of the Sunstone Spire and the capital city surrounding it. All magical energy would be diverted to reinforce a single, impenetrable shield dome over the heart of the kingdom. All travel in or out would be forbidden. The outlying regions, the Silverwood Marches, the Whispering Glens, they would be left to fend for themselves, their protection sacrificed to guarantee the safety of the core. When the king made the announcement from the central balcony, his voice amplified by magic to carry across the entire citadel, it was not met with relief, but with a stunned, horrified silence that was more powerful than any scream. To the elves within the capital, it felt like a betrayal of their very identity, an admission that their realm was so fragile, it needed to be sealed away like a precious artifact in a glass case. But to the elves in the outlying territories, watching through scrying pools or hearing the news from frantic messengers, it was far worse. It was a formal declaration that they were expendable. The king, in his desperation to protect the symbol of their power, had abandoned the people who lived in its shadow. The consequence was immediate and volcanic. Peaceful protests erupted at the sealed gates of the capital. Regional governors, whose loyalty had never been questioned, sent terse, furious declarations of autonomy, severing their magical conduits to the Lumina Tree in an act of self-preservation that felt like an amputation. The unified Elven realm, for the first time in its history, began to visibly, audibly crack apart. For Elowen, watching this unfold from the shadows, the king's decision created a rift straight through the center of her soul. As a high mage of the court, her duty was clear. She was sworn to obey her king, to uphold his decrees, and to trust that his painful choice was made for the greater good. To support the lockdown was to align herself with order, with the preservation of their most vital asset, even if the method was brutally pragmatic. She understood the terrifying logic behind it. If the capital fell, if the Lumina Tree was destroyed, then all was truly lost. This harsh measure could be a temporary, necessary evil to buy them time to find a real solution, but the other path called to her with a more powerful, more painful urgency. To rally the dissenting voices, the alienated regions, the scared and angry citizens. That was to embrace a different kind of duty. It was a duty to the idea of the kingdom, to its people, not just its throne. She had walked among them. She had seen the withering groves and the corrupted Wardstones. She had felt their fear and their resentment long before it boiled over into open unrest. To side with them now would be to validate their suffering and to offer them a vision of unity that wasn't based on walls and isolation, but on shared purpose and mutual defense. It would mean standing before a crowd of disillusioned elves and trying to rebuild the trust the king's decree had shattered in a single stroke. The stakes of this choice were immense and terrifyingly personal. Publicly supporting the king would grant her safety and the continued authority of her position within the capital, but it would forever brand her as a part of the oppressive system in the eyes of the suffering majority. It would be a betrayal of everything she had witnessed in the Silverwood, a rejection of Kalin's teachings, and a denial of the truth she had fought so hard to uncover. Yet, openly rallying the dissenters would make her a traitor in the eyes of the crown, an enemy of the state. She would lose all access to the palace, to the archives, to any hope of working within the system to find the heart of Ethelgard. She would be forced entirely into the shadows, leading a rebellion against the very institution she was trying to save. And all the while, the Verdant Veil watched the chaos with grim satisfaction. The king's desperate act played directly into their narrative. Every elf turned away at the capital's gates, every region left undefended, was a potential new recruit. They moved through the discontented crowds not as instigators, but as compassionate listeners, offering simple, violent solutions to complex problems. Their message found fertile ground in the soil of the king's well-intentioned but catastrophic decision. The lockdown, designed to create security, was instead creating an army for the enemy. Elowen's dilemma was no longer just a question of loyalty. It was a race against a shadow, a calculation of which choice would save more souls and deny the Verdant Veil the victory they so clearly saw within their grasp. The unity of the Elven people, once their greatest strength, was now a thin, fraying thread, and the weight of whether it would snap or hold rested on the decision of a single mage, trapped between her king and her conscience. The soul thread spell was a terrifying unraveling of the self, a sensation of being pulled into 1,000 directions at once. Elowen's consciousness streamed down through the cold stone of the palace foundations, a single, determined note of light, following a discordant symphony of decay. It led her through forgotten passages, down staircases that had not felt a footfall in centuries, into a cavernous space that hummed with a power so ancient it felt like the bedrock of the world itself. And there it was, the heart of Ethelgard. It was not the glittering, pristine crystal of legend. It was a pulsating, sickly thing, shot through with veins of black corruption that throbbed like a diseased heart. Its light, which should have been a radiant, life-giving gold, was a murky, ominous green, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. But reaching, it was not a matter of simply walking into the chamber. The artifact's corrupting influence had not remained contained. The chamber was guarded by the silent sentinels, ancient stone golems animated by the first elves, and left to slumber in eternal vigilance. They were meant to be protectors, unmoving statues until a true threat awoke them. The heart's twisted energy had done more than awaken them. It had poisoned their core programming. The magic that gave them purpose had been inverted. Their solemn duty to guard had been warped into a mindless, violent imperative to destroy. As Elowen's spirit snapped back into her body with a gasp that tore at her lungs, she opened her eyes to meet Kalin's terrified gaze. They had found it, and now they had to get past its guardians. The descent into the Under Palace was a journey into a nightmare version of their home's history. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and rust. The gentle hum of the Lumina Tree's energy, usually a comforting presence even through layers of stone, was gone, replaced by the low, menacing growl of the corrupted artifact. When they finally reached the vast, circular chamber, the sentinels stood revealed. There were 4 of them, each twice the height of an elf, their bodies crafted from seamless, magically infused stone that had once gleamed with a soft inner light. Now that light was the same sickly green as the heart, flickering erratically behind their eye slits. They did not move with the slow, ponderous gait of constructs, but with an unnerving, predatory grace, their movements silent and lethally precise. They were no longer guardians, they were thralls, their ancient magic hijacked and turned into a weapon against any who would approach their poisoned charge. The battle was not a clash of spells and steel in any conventional sense. It was a desperate, draining game of evasion and deflection. Elowen's most powerful offensive spells, designed to shatter rock and sunder enchantments, splashed harmlessly against the sentinels' hides, absorbed and amplified by the heart's corrupting field, only making the guardians stronger. Kalin, armed with his vast knowledge of obscure and theoretical magic, could only weave disruptive wards, creating temporary barriers that slowed the constructs for mere seconds before they shattered under the relentless assault. They were not fighting to win, they were fighting for inches, dodging crushing stone fists and blasts of corrupted energy that seared the very air. Each step forward toward the pulsating artifact, costing them dearly in stamina and magic. During a frantic retreat from a synchronized pincer movement, Elowen found herself and Kalin cornered against a wall of ancient, rune-etched stone. A sentinel loomed over them, its fist raised for a final, crushing blow. There was no time for a complex incantation, no space to dodge. In that moment of absolute desperation, a forgotten spell surfaced in her mind from the deepest recesses of her training, the Sunstone Surge. It was a technique of last resort, a spell that bypassed external magic sources and tapped directly into the caster's own life force, converting vitality into raw, unstoppable power. The texts warned that it was like trying to put out a fire by burning your own hand. It saved you from the flame by ensuring you would never use that hand again. There was no choice. As the stone fist descended, Elowen didn't speak a word. She simply reached inward, gripping the core of her own being, and pulled. A light not of gold, but of pure, blinding white erupted from her, a concussive wave of force that did not harm the sentinel, but unraveled the corrupted magic, holding it together. The construct didn't shatter, it dissolved into a pile of inert, mundane gravel. The cost was immediate and excruciating. Elowen collapsed to one knee, a searing pain lancing through her chest, as if a vital part of her had been torn out and spent. The world swam before her eyes, colors fading to a dull gray, the constant hum of magic she had lived with since birth now sounding distant and faint. She had not just used her magic, she had burned a piece of her soul. With the immediate threat neutralized, a path to the heart was clear, but their success felt hollow, tasted of ash. Kalin rushed to her side, his face a mask of horror at the price she had paid. They had reached their goal, they had survived the Guardians, but the victory was Purification. Elowen's strength, the very essence of her power as a high mage, was diminished, perhaps permanently. The cost of reaching the artifact was not measured in spells cast or enemies defeated, but in the irreversible damage to the one person who possessed the skill and purity of purpose to possibly undo the corruption. They now stood before the source of all their world's suffering, but the fight to get there had left them broken, and the greater battle to cleanse, it had not yet even begun. The silence that followed the desperate battle in the Underpalace was a fragile, precious thing, but it was shattered in an instant, not by a sound, but by a sensation. A deep, resonant wrongness vibrated through the very stones of the citadel. A dissonant chord played on the strings of the world itself. The air, usually thick with the harmonious flow of magic, suddenly crackled with violent, conflicting energies. From the chamber high above, screams began to echo down the stairwells, not of pain, but of pure, unadulterated panic. Elowen, still weak and reeling from the cost of the Sunstone surge, felt it through her fading connection to the Lumina Tree. The Verdant Veil was not waiting. Their gambit had begun. They had studied the kingdom's weaknesses with the precision of master surgeons, and now they were making their incisions. This was not a frontal assault on the palace gates. It was a strategic, coordinated strike against the very circulatory system of Elven society. Across the capital and its outlying regions, teams of Veil operatives, their faces hidden by masks of woven leaves, emerged from the crowds and shadows. Their targets were the magical nexuses, the public fountains whose waters carried healing energies, the grand plazas whose stones were enchanted to promote peace and clarity, the Wardstone networks that allowed for instant communication across vast distances. These were not weapons, they were the utilities of daily life, the invisible infrastructure that made the Elven realm a paradise. The Veil's attack was as insidious as it was brilliant. They didn't destroy these nexuses, they perverted them, using corrupted crystals and twisted versions of the very spells that had built them. They began a frantic, violent process of hijacking. The healing fountain in the sun-kissed plaza began to bubble with a corrosive, black liquid that ate away at the surrounding stone. The peaceful aura of the grand concourse inverted into a wave of psychic feedback, sending elves clutching their heads in agony and paranoia. The Waystones didn't go dark. They began broadcasting a single, repeating psychic image, the symbol of the Verdant Veil, overlaid with a compelling, seductive promise of power and renewal for those who would join their cause. It was psychological warfare combined with a hostile takeover of their most vital resources. Their aim was clear: to seize control of the kingdom's entire magical energy grid, to hold the basic necessities of light, communication, and health ransom, demonstrating the utter incompetence of the crown and proving their own power in one devastating stroke. The consequence was instantaneous and total chaos. The beautiful, orderly streets of the capital descended into a nightmare. Elves who had known nothing but peace for 1,000 years now ran in blind terror, unsure of where the next attack would come from or what form it would take. The gentle glow of the street lanterns flickered and died, plunging entire districts into darkness, broken only by the erratic, sickly green flashes of corrupted magic. The air was filled with the sounds of shattering crystal, panicked shouts, and the horrifying new hum of the inverted nexuses. The pristine beauty of the elven realms, their greatest source of pride, was cracking apart in real time, revealing the fear and fragility that had been growing beneath its surface for decades. For Elowen and Kalin, stumbling out from the depths beneath the palace into this maelstrom, the scale of the crisis was overwhelming. They stood at a crossroads, both literal and philosophical. To their right, the path led upward to the royal palace. They could reinforce the king's guard, help defend the heart of their government, and protect King Thuron. A sovereign captured or killed would be a symbolic victory from which the kingdom might never recover. It was the clear, logical choice of a high mage sworn to the crown. Defend the seat of power, preserve the chain of command. It was a choice of duty, but to their left, the path led down into the city streets, into the thick of the panic. They could hear the cries of civilians trapped by the magical fallout, see the flicker of uncontrolled fires started by erratic energy discharges. These were the people the crown had just abandoned with its lockdown, the very elves whose suffering had fueled this rebellion. To go to them would be to turn away from the institution and toward the individuals it was meant to serve. It would be a choice of compassion, a direct repudiation of the king's isolationist policy in favor of hands-on, immediate aid. This was no longer a theoretical debate about loyalty and ideology. It was a brutally practical decision that would define Elowen's leadership in the eyes of every elf who survived this night. Choosing the palace meant upholding the structure of the old world, perhaps saving the king, but losing the people's faith forever. Choosing the streets meant embracing a new, messier form of leadership, one built not on titles and tradition, but on direct action and empathy, potentially at the cost of the entire government collapsing behind her. There was no time to weigh the long-term consequences. The screams from the city grew louder. The clash of steel and spell echoed from the palace gates. Her choice in this single, defining moment would write the first line of whatever history followed this night. With a final, agonized look toward the spires of the palace, Elowen made her decision. She turned her back on the throne and ran toward the sound of her people, crying out in the dark. The Verdant Veil's coordinated attack on the capital's magical heart was a masterstroke of chaos, but its most devastating impact was not the inverted nexuses or the panicked streets. It was the final, shattering blow to an idea, the idea that the Sunstone Spire could protect anyone. As the green-tinged darkness receded and the immediate, frantic struggle to aid the wounded began, a new, colder reality set in across the elven realms. The king's lockdown, his desperate attempt to preserve the core, had been proven a catastrophic failure. The capital itself had been brought to its knees. For the regional governors watching from afar through their scrying pools, the message was terrifyingly clear. If the crown could not even defend its own seat of power, it held no promise of safety for anyone else. One by one, like stars winking out at dawn, the declarations of secession began to arrive. They did not come from raving rebels or Veil sympathizers, but from respected, solemn leaders. The governor of the Silverwood Marches, whose lands had been the first to wither, sent a terse, grief-stricken scroll. It spoke of sentinels left to stand guard over dust, of repeated, unanswered pleas for aid, and ended with a simple, heartbreaking statement. We can no longer entrust our survival to a throne that sees us as expendable. Henceforth, we will govern our own defense. The sun-kissed reaches, whose orchards had once supplied the capital with enchanted fruits, declared a trade embargo, severing the flow of magic sustaining resources to the heartland. The Whispering Glens went further, their governor formally recognizing the Verdant Veil not as a terrorist organization, but as a legitimate political entity, a move that legitimized the very force the king was trying to crush. The unified elven realm, a tapestry woven over millennia, was not just fraying at the edges. It was being torn into distinct, suspicious, and increasingly hostile pieces. The quiet war of whispers and decay was over. The loud, brutal war of borders and banners had begun. For Elowen, standing amid the still smoking ruins of a city plaza she had helped secure, the news was a weight that threatened to crush what little strength she had left. Her choice to aid the civilians had saved countless lives and cemented her role as a leader of the people, but it had come at a cost. She was now irrevocably outside the king's inner circle, viewed with suspicion by the crown for her disobedience, and with fervent hope by the dissenting masses. This new crisis of secession forced upon her a decision more complex than any battle tactic. The fractures were now physical and political. The governors weren't enemies, they were frightened leaders protecting their people, just as she was. To advocate for immediate, aggressive conflict, to support the king's inevitable desire to reunify the realms by force, would be to plunge their entire civilization into a civil war. It would mean elven armies, once dedicated to guarding against external threats, turning their spells and blades upon each other. It would validate the Veil's entire ideology that the old world could only be cleansed through violent, destructive rebirth. Yet, the path of negotiation felt equally fraught with peril. To approach the breakaway regions as equals, to sit at a table with governors who had openly defied the crown and even legitimized the Veil, would be seen by King Thuron and his loyalists as the ultimate betrayal. It would undermine the very concept of central authority at a time when unity was needed most. Furthermore, it would require a level of trust that felt almost naive. Could she truly negotiate with powers who might be secretly aligned with, or even controlled by, the very saboteurs who had unleashed the weeping? Would talk simply be a stalling tactic, allowing the Verdant Veil to consolidate its power in these new, independent states, away from the crown's scrutiny? A misstep in diplomacy could be as deadly as a lost battle, leaving the kingdom vulnerable from within while she was distracted by words. Her decision would set a precedent for centuries to come. Choosing conflict meant embracing the belief that the realms could only be held together by strength and fear, potentially creating resentments that would fuel unrest for generations. Choosing negotiation meant accepting that the golden age of a unified elven empire was already over, and that the future lay in a fragile coalition of independent states, a network of alliances that could easily shatter under pressure. There was no path that led back to the world she had known. There were only paths forward into an uncertain, dangerous new reality, and the choice she made would determine whether the first chapter of this new age was written in blood or in ink. The stakes had escalated from saving a tree or a city to defining the very soul and structure of elven civilization for the foreseeable future, and the eyes of every elf loyalist and secessionist alike, were turned toward her. The chamber housing the corrupted heart of Ethelgard was a tomb for hope. The air itself was thick and heavy, tasting of spoiled honey and cold iron, each breath a struggle against the artifact's suffocating aura. Elowen's body still ached from the profound expenditure of the Sunstone Surge, a hollow, echoing emptiness where a vast reservoir of her power had once resided. Yet as she and Kalin cautiously approached the pulsating crystal, a new, more terrifying understanding began to dawn, not from the artifact itself, but from the frantic, desperate calculations Kalin was scribbling onto a spare piece of parchment, his hand trembling as he cross-referenced the corrupted energy patterns with the fragmented lore from his archives. He wasn't devising a way to destroy the heart. That, he muttered, was impossible. Its power was too fundamental, too woven into the fabric of their world. To shatter it would be to unravel the ley lines themselves, causing a magical cataclysm that would make the weeping look like a gentle frost. The only path was purification. They had to somehow cleanse the corruption, to reverse the polarity of the energy and restore the heart to its original purpose. But magic, especially magic of this magnitude, did not operate on good intentions alone. It demanded balance. A corruption this deep, this pervasive, could not be simply washed away. It required a counterweight of equal and opposite purity. A sacrifice. Kalin's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible over the low, menacing hum of the artifact. The texts are clear, but the equations are brutal. The energy required to purge this level of defilement isn't just immense. It has to be perfectly pure, untainted by ambition, unmarred by pride, unweakened by doubt. It can't be drawn from the environment. The very air here is poisoned. It can't be siphoned from the Lumina Tree. Its energy is now tainted by the same sickness we're trying to cure. He looked up from his notes, his face ashen, his eyes filled with a dread that told alone in the answer before he even spoke it. The only source of magic pure enough to act as a catalyst for this kind of purification is a living soul. A mage who has not been compromised, a will that remains uncorrupted. It would require a voluntary offering of one's entire magical essence, one's life force poured directly into the heart. It would be a total expenditure. There would be nothing left to return to. The words hung in the poisonous air, absolute and final. The price of power was not a title or a throne. It was everything. It was her very existence. Elowen felt the truth of it settle into the hollow space the Sunstone Surge had already carved out of her. She was the only candidate. She was a high mage of the Sunstone Spire, one of the most powerful elves left in a realm now tearing itself apart. More importantly, she was the one who had discovered the Decay, who had fought the court's denial, who had walked the dying forests and felt the pain of the land. Her connection to the magic was still pure, her intent uncorrupted by the desire for destruction that fueled the Verdant Veil. She had already proven her willingness to spend her own strength to protect others. This was merely the logical, horrifying conclusion of that path. An internal struggle erupted within her, silent and violent. The instinct for self-preservation was a primal scream in the core of her being. She had already given so much: her reputation, her place in the court, her friendship with Lyra, a significant portion of her power. Was she now to give what little remained? to cease to exist, not in a blaze of glory seen by all, but in this forgotten, dark chamber, her life force used as a key to turn a lock. The thought was a terrifying abyss. She was not some ancient, weary soul ready to depart. She was in the prime of her life, with work left to do, a world left to heal, the desire to live, to see the sunlight again, to guide the rebuilding she had fought so hard to make possible, was an almost physical ache. But countering that was the immense, crushing weight of responsibility. She saw, in her mind's eye, the faces of the elves in the panicked streets. She saw the withering groves of the silverwood. She felt the fading heartbeat of the Lumina Tree. If she walked away, if she chose to preserve herself, who would be left to make this choice? The king, hiding behind his shields. The Verdant Veil, who would only use the artifact to accelerate the destruction. Her death would not be a single point of failure. It would be the only chance for a cascade of survival. Her legacy would not be defined by the years she lived, but by the eternity she secured for her people with a single, final act. As she stood on the precipice of this impossible decision, Kalin, his voice thick with a grief that acknowledged what she was considering, offered a final, crucial warning. Elowen, even if you choose this path, we cannot know all the consequences. You would be pouring your consciousness, your very soul, into a vessel that is currently a nexus of absolute malice. Purification is the goal, but the process, it would be agony beyond comprehension. And what if it doesn't work? What if the corruption is too strong? Your sacrifice could be for nothing, or worse. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the pulsating green veins within the crystal. What if it doesn't just purge the darkness? What if it merges with it? Your purity, your love for this kingdom, fused with the veil's hatred for it. We could be creating something entirely new and entirely unpredictable. The cure could become a greater plague. His warning added a new, terrifying dimension to her choice. It was no longer a simple equation of her life for the kingdoms. It was a gamble with the very nature of salvation itself. She would be stepping into an alchemical reaction of the soul, where the outcome was unknown. She could be the savior, a martyr whose death brought life, or she could be the final ingredient in a recipe for a horror they could not yet imagine. The weight of the decision was absolute, a mountain on her shoulders. To sacrifice was to embrace a hope shadowed by unimaginable risk. To refuse was to choose a certain, gradual doom. There were no good options, only choices carved from desperation and faith. In the oppressive silence of the chamber, with the corrupted heartbeat of her world thrumming against her skin, Elowen understood that the path forward was not lit by glory, but by the terrifying, self-consuming light of a sacrifice that might save everything or end it. The oppressive silence in the corrupted chamber was broken only by the sickly, rhythmic pulse of the heart of Ethelgard, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the bones and poison the soul. Elowen stood frozen before the artifact, the weight of Kalin's horrific calculation pressing down on her, the unavoidable truth that purification demanded a sacrifice of pure magic, a life given completely and without reserve. The internal war between her will to live and her duty to her people raged, a silent scream in the hollowed-out space the sunstone surge had left within her. She was preparing to speak, to utter her acceptance of this terrible price, when a calm, steady hand settled on her shoulder. She turned to find Kalin watching her, his expression not one of fear or grief, but of profound, settled resolve. The frantic energy of the scholar had vanished, replaced by a deep, unshakable peace. "No, Elowen," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, yet carrying a finality that filled the entire chamber. "Your part in this is not to end here in the dark. Mine is." He gestured to the notes still clutched in his other hand, the frantic equations now seeming like a map he had already finished reading. "You misunderstood my calculations. The purification doesn't require a source of pure magic to counter the corruption. It requires a vessel to contain it. A filter. The poison must be drawn out of the heart and into something else, something that can hold it long enough for the artifact's natural, benevolent energy to reassert itself." A cold dread, colder than any they had faced, began to creep into Elowen's heart as she understood his meaning. He wasn't talking about a spell, he was talking about a transfusion. "I have been studying this, not just for these past days, but for decades in my exile," he continued, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "It was always a theoretical madness, the rambling of a disgraced archivist. But the principle is sound. The corruption is a form of energy, and all energy seeks a vessel. I can make myself the most attractive one. I can pull the sickness from the heart and into my own body." He said it with the simple clarity of stating a historical fact, as if he were describing the fall of a dynasty rather than the end of his own life. Elowen's protest was immediate, a raw, desperate denial. "Kalin, no, the strain would obliterate you in an instant. There would be nothing left. It's not a vessel you'd be, it's a target." She reached for him, but he took a step back toward the pulsating crystal, his gaze unwavering. "Obliteration is a mercy I do not deserve," he replied, and for the first time, a flicker of his old pain showed in his eyes. "My life has been defined by isolation, by knowing the truth and being punished for speaking it. I have watched the kingdom I loved from a distance, trapped in a prison of my own making and theirs. This is not an end. It is a reconciliation. It is the one truly useful thing I can do with knowledge they called heresy. My exile taught me how to be a container for things no one else wanted to hold. Let me hold this one last thing." His words were not those of a man seeking glory or even redemption. They were the words of a scholar offering the final, definitive proof for his life's work. He saw his own body as the last page of his most important text. Before Elowen could form another argument, another plea, he turned toward the heart of Ethelgard and began to chant. The words were not in any language she knew. They were older, guttural and resonant, a song of invitation and absorption. He wasn't casting a spell at the artifact. He was rewriting the magical signature of his own soul, making it a perfect, irresistible receptacle for the malice that infected it. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The veins of black corruption within the crystal writhed like living things, detaching from the heart and streaming across the chamber, not as light, but as a torrent of tangible shadow. They poured into Kalin, not through a wound, but through his skin, his eyes, his very being. He did not scream. He stood rigid, his back arched, accepting the flood of pure desolation. His form began to glow with the same sickly, violent green light, his outline flickering as the immense power threatened to unmoor him from reality itself. But he held. He was the vessel, and he did not break. As the last of the darkness left the heart of Ethelgard, the crystal erupted in a light of soft, radiant gold, so pure and warm it washed the chamber clean of the lingering dread. The Lumina Tree, miles above them, would have felt the shock wave of healing energy instantly, its roots drinking in the first clean magic they had tasted in months. The artifact was stable. The cascade failure had been averted. Kalin, however, was now the epicenter of the corruption. He turned to face Elowen, his body translucent, his eyes pools of churning darkness. His voice, when it came, was an echo, strained but clear. "It is done. The tree is safe. For now, the kingdoms are still broken. They need a leader who understands both light and shadow. They need you." He took a shuddering breath, a human gesture that seemed absurd from his fading form. "Do not let my sacrifice be a monument. Let it be a catalyst. Unite them, Elowen. Make them see that their strength was never in their perfection, but in their resilience. Tell them to remember. He did not vanish in an explosion or a whisper. He simply unraveled. The contained corruption, with no vessel left to hold it, dissipated into the newly cleansed air, not as a poison, but as harmless motes of extinguished energy, like dust in a sunbeam. Where Kalin had stood, there was only silence and the gentle, golden light of the restored heart. Elowen stood alone, the emptiness inside her now filled with a resolve as hard and brilliant as diamond. Her grief was immense, a wave that threatened to drown her, but it crashed against this new, unbreakable purpose. Kalin had given her more than time. He had given her a mandate. His death was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a foundation to be built upon. The quiet, brilliant, forgotten archivist had, with a single courageous act, rewritten the future. And Elowen, with the warmth of the healed heart on her face and the cold ache of loss in her heart, knew that her work had only just begun. She had a story to tell and a kingdom to rally. The silence in the chamber after Kalin's dissolution was the loudest sound Elowen had ever heard, a void filled with the echo of his final words and the gentle, steady hum of the now purified heart of Ethelgard. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her hand pressed against the warm, radiant crystal, feeling the clean magic flow through her, a stark contrast to the hollow ache of her own depleted power and the profound grief settling in her bones. He was gone. The brilliant, difficult, courageous archivist had given everything, not for glory or redemption, but for a single, clear purpose, to give her a chance. And she could not waste it. The task ahead was no longer about investigation or survival. It was about translation. She had to take his ultimate, silent act and turn it into a language that a fractured, warring people could understand. She emerged from the depths of the palace, not as a fugitive or a rogue mage, but as a herald. The golden light of the heart's restoration had been a physical wave that washed through the capital, a sudden, shocking warmth that cut through the lingering chill of the veil's corrupted magic. The inverted nexuses sputtered and died. The psychic broadcasts from the waystones fell silent. The violent green energy that had pulsed through the streets faded, replaced by the familiar, gentle glow of the city's natural enchantments, now flickering weakly back to life. In the sudden, comparative quiet, the sounds of confusion and fear were palpable. Elowen climbed the steps to the highest public balcony of the Sunstone Spire, the one used for royal proclamations. her robes still dusty from the under-palace, her face etched with exhaustion and a new, unshakable resolve. She had no amplification crystal, no guard of honor. She simply stood at the railing and began to speak, her voice, though tired, carrying with it the raw authority of someone who has stared into the abyss and returned with a truth too important to silence. She did not speak of victory. She did not condemn the Verdant Veil or praise the king. She spoke of Kalin. She told them of the exiled scholar they had all been taught to fear and ignore. She described his decades of lonely study, his dedication to preserving the knowledge they had chosen to forget, and she told them, in simple, unadorned words, what he had just done. She made them see it, not as a grand magical feat, but as the final, logical extension of a life spent caring for the kingdom more than for his own place within it. He held the darkness so that we could see the light again, she said, her voice breaking not with performative grief, but with the genuine weight of the loss. He asked for no monuments. He asked only that we remember, and that we choose to be better than the fear that divided us. Her words landed not like a battle cry, but like a seed falling on freshly turned soil. In the streets below, elves who had moments before been ready to kill each other over ideological differences now stood still, looking at their hands, at the fading scars of the recent battle, at the faces of their neighbors. A soldier in the king's livery lowered his sword, his gaze shifting from a Veil sympathizer he had cornered to the balcony high above. The sympathizer, seeing the shift, also relaxed his defensive stance. It was not forgiveness, and it was not trust. It was a pause, a shared moment of breath, forced upon them by the magnitude of a sacrifice that made their own squabbles seem suddenly, terribly small. This was the fragile alliance, built not on treaties or terms, but on a collective, humbling shock. It was a ceasefire born of awe, and like all things built on emotion, it was terrifyingly temporary. From her vantage point, Elowen could see the tenuous nature of the peace. Loyalist captains were already regrouping their men, their eyes hard with suspicion, watching the disbanding Veil cells for any sign of trickery. The Veil members themselves, stripped of their corrupted tools, but not their fervent beliefs, gathered in tight, nervous clusters, their body language screaming defiance and mistrust. The silence was not peaceful. It was the quiet of two exhausted armies staring each other down across a field, waiting for the first sign of movement to restart the slaughter. The rally of hope had created an opportunity, a single, narrow window of possibility, but it would slam shut the instant someone decided to raise a weapon again. This left Elowen with a decision that felt like choosing between two different kinds of fire. One path was to capitalize on this moment of stunned unity and press for a decisive military strike. The Verdant Veil's leadership, including her former mentor Arian, would be disoriented, their magical advantage gone. A coordinated attack by the king's forces, combined with the moral authority she now wielded, could decapitate the movement in a single night. It would be a clear, brutal end to the immediate threat. It promised a return to a recognizable order, a chance to rebuild without the constant specter of rebellion. But it was a path paved with the bodies of elves who, however misguided, were ultimately driven by a desperate desire for change. It would forever cement the narrative of us versus them, creating martyrs and fueling resentments that would simmer for generations. It was the choice of a commander, and it guaranteed a peace enforced by the edge of a blade. The other path was the infinitely more dangerous and complex road of peace talks. It would mean approaching Arian and the other Veil leaders not as criminals to be executed, but as political entities to be negotiated with. It would require sitting across a table from the architect of so much suffering and looking for common ground. It would mean convincing a terrified and angry loyalist faction to grant concessions to those they saw as terrorists. This path offered the only true hope for a lasting, healed peace, a chance to address the legitimate grievances of the outlying regions that had birthed the Veil in the first place. But it was a gamble of the highest order. Negotiation could be seen as weakness, emboldening the Veil's remaining hardliners. It would require a level of trust that felt almost impossible, and any failure would shatter the fragile ceasefire instantly, likely with even greater bloodshed than before. It was the choice of a statesman, a gamble on the better angels of their nature, and the price of failure was annihilation. Elowen looked out over the quieting city, at the faces turned up toward her, waiting for her next move. She held their fate in her hands. Kalin had given her this chance not to choose the easiest path, but to choose the right one. The alliance was an illusion if it could not be made real. The hope was a phantom if it could not be given a form to live in. Unity was no longer an abstract concept. It was her greatest and most immediate challenge, a mountain she had to climb not with an army at her back, but with words, wisdom, and the fragile, terrifying faith that even in the heart of an enemy, there might be a flicker of the same love for their people that burned in her own. The fragile ceasefire, woven from the threads of Kalin's sacrifice, was a thin pane of glass over a chasm. It could not last. Elowen knew that true peace would not be found in the stunned silence that followed her speech, but in confronting the source of the storm. Using channels known only to those who had once studied under the same master, she sent a single, unadorned message into the ether, a request for parley. The response was not a written word, but a location, the Grove of Whispers, a place where they had once practiced advanced magic, where the trees themselves remembered the sound of their laughter and the shared pursuit of knowledge. It was a choice heavy with painful symbolism. She went alone, as she had to the roots of the Lumina Tree so long ago. The grove was as beautiful as she remembered, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy of silver leaves, the air sweet with the scent of night-blooming sylvanthus. But the elf who stood waiting at its center was a stranger wearing a familiar face. Arian, her mentor, the mage who had taught her that magic was a responsibility, not a weapon, now stood with an aura of grim purpose that seemed to leach the warmth from the very light around him. He did not look like a fanatic or a conqueror. He looked like a weary physician who had concluded that a limb must be amputated to save the patient's life. Elowen, he said, his voice the same calm, measured baritone she remembered from countless lessons. There was no malice in it, only a profound, chilling certainty. I felt the shift in the magic, a bold act, a wasteful one. You stabilized a patient who is already dead. You have merely prolonged the agony. The confrontation did not begin with spells, but with ideas. It was a duel of philosophies fought in the space between them. Arian spoke not of power or control, but of love, a fierce, desperate love for the Elven people, and the potential he believed they had squandered. Look at what we became, he urged, his gesture taking in not just the grove, but the entire concept of the kingdom. A beautiful, static painting, we cease to grow, to evolve, to truly live. We traded innovation for tradition, curiosity for comfort. The Lumina Tree was not our heart, Elowen, it was our anchor, holding us fast in the shallow waters of the past, while the great ocean of possibility lay beyond our sight. My methods are harsh, I do not deny it. The weeping is a terrible mercy, but it is the only way to burn out the rot of complacency and allow for new, stronger growth. What is the death of a forest compared to the birth of a new world? His vision was seductive in its terrible clarity. He was not a monster. He was a radical gardener who believed the entire orchard was blighted and needed to be razed to the ground. He saw the Verdant Veil not as terrorists, but as midwives to a painful, necessary rebirth. His followers were not dupes. They were idealists who had lost faith in the old ways and were desperately hungry for the new dawn he promised. Elowen listened, her heart breaking not from anger, but from understanding. She saw the truth in his diagnosis. She had fought the same stagnation, felt the same frustration with a court that prized beautiful lies over difficult truths. For a terrifying moment, she saw the path he offered, and a part of her recognized its grim logic. It would be so much simpler to let it all fall, to embrace the chaos as a purifying fire, and build something new from the ashes. But then she thought of the hollowed-out sentinels in the Silverwood, standing guard over dust. She thought of the civilians caught in the crossfire of his necessary chaos. She thought of Kalin, who had given his life to prove that their world was still worth saving in its current, imperfect form. "You are right, Arian," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "We were stagnant, we were proud, we hid our flaws behind a glittering facade, but you are wrong about the cure. You confuse pruning with annihilation. You see a sick tree, and your solution is to salt the earth so nothing can ever grow there again. True strength isn't born from nothingness. It is forged in the repair of what is broken." Kalin did not die to preserve a perfect past. He died to give us a chance to build a better future, one that acknowledges its scars instead of hiding them. She offered him a different path, one far more difficult than destruction, redemption. Lay down your weapons, not your ideas. Bring your vision, your passion for change to the council table. Help me reform the system from within. Show them a way forward that doesn't require burning our history to the ground. The people are listening now. They are ready for a new song. Help me write it, instead of forcing us to scream. The conflict that erupted then was not one of magic, but a fundamental belief. Arian's eyes, once filled with the patience of a teacher, now flashed with the impatience of a revolutionary who sees his moment slipping away. You still believe in dialogue, in the good hearts of those who dismissed you, who exiled Kalin, who abandoned their own people to die at the borders. That is not resilience, Elowen, that is naivety. They will smile and nod and promise change, and the moment the crisis is over, they will return to their gilded halls and forget the promises they made. The only language they understand is power. The only change they will accept is that which is forced upon them. Their raised voices were a stark dissonance in the peaceful grove, a violent clash of ideologies where no blow was struck, yet every word was a wound. He saw her hope as a fatal weakness. She saw his certainty as a tragic blindness. The entire fractured kingdom seemed to hold its breath, its fate balanced on the outcome of this argument between a teacher and his greatest student. Elowen's choice in that moment was the most profound of her life. To defeat him would be to use the power she had left, to strike down the man who had shaped her, to become the very instrument of the violent suppression he predicted. But to continue trying to redeem him was to risk everything on the faint hope that the mentor she loved still existed beneath the revolutionary's mask, a gamble that could allow him to regroup and unleash even greater suffering. She stood at the precipice, holding the competing weights of mercy and justice in each hand, knowing that the path she chose would define the moral character of the new world she was fighting to create. The philosophical duel in the Grove of Whispers shattered into a million pieces. Arian's calm certainty curdled into a cold, final resolve. He saw Elowen's plea for redemption not as an offer, but as an ultimatum, a confirmation that the old world would never voluntarily relinquish its grip. Her hope was the very disease he was determined to burn out. "You leave me no choice," he said, his voice devoid of its former warmth, now as flat and cold as a polished blade. "If you will not see the necessity of the new dawn, then you will perish with the old night." In a flash of movement too quick to follow, he produced not a weapon, but a small, dark crystal, a shard he had secretly taken from the heart of Ethelgard before its purification, a piece of the corruption he had kept in reserve. Before Elowen could react, he slammed it into the earth at his feet. The effect was not an explosion, but an implosion of reality. The grove did not burst apart, it unraveled. The vibrant colors of the leaves leached away into a monochrome gray. The sweet scent of sylvanthus was replaced by the odor of ozone and nothingness. The very sound vanished, replaced by a pressure that felt like the weight of the ocean in the depths. Arian was not casting a spell. He was using the shard as a key, a focal point to tap back into the artifact's core, programming from a distance, bypassing its purified state and forcing it to obey his last, most terrible command, a total magical reset. He wasn't trying to corrupt the world anymore. He was trying to delete it, to erase the canvas of elven magic entirely, so that only a blank slate remained for him to paint his new world upon. High above, in the sunstone spire, the Lumina Tree gave a shudder that resonated through every stone in the city. Its light, which had just begun to steady into a soft gold, flickered wildly, not dimming, but unraveling. Beams of pure energy, not destructive, but foundational, began to bleed out of its form, dissipating into the air like mist. This was not an attack, it was an unmooring. The artifact, forced into this catastrophic function, was beginning to sever the connection between the elven people and the magic that was their birthright. Elves throughout the city cried out as they felt a terrifying hollowing sensation, a fundamental part of their identity beginning to fade, a song they had always known falling silent note by note. The fate of every elf, not just their kingdom, now hung in the balance, threatened not with death, but with an unimaginable amnesia of the soul. Elowen felt the pull immediately, a draining sensation that started in her fingertips and crawled inward toward her core. Her own magic, already weakened by the sunstone surge, felt thin and insubstantial. Her first, primal instinct was to resist, to dig deep into her own well of power and fight back with everything she had left. She raised her hands, pouring her will into a shield, a desperate attempt to contain the unraveling energy emanating from Arian and his shard, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a piece of parchment. Her individual strength, even at its peak, was a single candle against a hurricane. The shield flickered and strained, the immense world-altering power of the artifact threatening to shatter her completely. In that moment of absolute, terrifying vulnerability, she understood the final, brutal lesson. This was not a battle to be won by a hero. It was a crisis that could only be weathered by a chorus. Letting her personal shield fall, she did something that went against every instinct of a high mage, trained for individual excellence. She opened herself completely. Instead of fighting the pull of the unraveling magic, she reached out with her consciousness, not to the artifact, but to the people, to the loyalist soldiers regrouping in the streets, their discipline frayed by fear, to the confused and frightened members of the Verdant Veil, who suddenly saw their promised rebirth turning into an abyss, to the civilians huddled in their homes, feeling their very essence begin to fade. She did not send them a complex spell or a battle plan. She sent them a feeling, a single, clear, unwavering sensation of a hand held out, waiting for another to grasp it. It was an invitation to unity, not an order. The response was not immediate, and it was not uniform, but across the city, individual acts of courage began to spark in the deepening gray. A loyalist captain, feeling the strange pull of Elowen's call, hesitated, then turned to a Veil sympathizer he had been facing off against moments before. Without a word, he simply nodded, and the two former opponents placed their hands on each other's shoulders, a physical connection that became a magical conduit. A group of healers, their powers flickering, joined hands around a public fountain, their combined focus creating a tiny, localized pool of stable energy. A young scribe and a master artisan, from opposite ends of the city's social divide, felt the same impulse and reached out, their different magical strengths, one for intricate detail, the other for raw creation, snapping together like complementary gears. Elowen, standing at the epicenter of the storm, became the nexus for this desperate patchwork network. She did not command the energy, she guided it. She was the conductor for an orchestra that had never played together, harmonizing 1,000 different strands of magic, some powerful, some faint, some refined, some raw, into a single, focused purpose. The power that flowed through her was no longer her own. It was theirs. It was the stubborn resilience of the border guards, the creative spark of the artists, the nurturing warmth of the healers, the disciplined focus of the scholars, and even the fierce, desperate hope of the disillusioned, all woven together into a tapestry of collective will. She shaped this conglomerate energy not into a weapon to strike Arian down, but into a counter-song, a melody of preservation and memory that she directed not at him, but at the unraveling Lumina Tree itself. The final confrontation was not a clash of blinding lights and concussive blasts. It was a silent, immense struggle of opposing frequencies. From Arian's shard emanated a single, pure note of erasure, a sound that sought to simplify the world into nothingness. From Elowen and her unwitting choir emanated a complex, beautiful, and dissonant symphony of everything that was Elven, their joys and sorrows, their traditions and innovations, their perfections and their flaws. It was the sound of a people refusing to be simplified. The two forces met in the air between the grove and the spire, a collision of realities that made the very sky seem to warp and shudder. Arian, his face a mask of furious isolation, poured his own immense power into the shard, a single, brilliant voice, trying to shout down a chorus of thousands. But he was alone, and the chorus, for all its imperfections, was united. The tide began to turn. The gray receded, not in a rush, but inch by inch, as the collective song of the elves gently, insistently, pushed back the silence, reminding the world of what it was and what it could still be. The silent struggle in the sky above the grove was a war fought with frequencies, not with fire. The unified will of 1,000 elves, channeled through Elowen, did not smash into Arian's single note of erasure. It surrounded it, enveloped it, and began to gently, insistently recalibrate it. The corrupt shard at his feet, the last conduit to the heart's destructive potential, did not explode. It resonated with the collective song of preservation until it could no longer hold its malignant shape, dissolving into a fine, harmless dust that was carried away on a suddenly warm breeze. Arian did not fall in battle. He simply sank to his knees, not in defeat, but in a profound, bewildered silence, watching the world he had tried to unmake instead choose to remake itself. The immediate threat was over, but the cost of that victory was measured in the deep, resonant crack that echoed from the sunstone spire, a sound heard not with the ears, but with the soul. The Lumina Tree, having been pushed to the absolute brink of unraveling and then pulled back by a force it was never designed to channel, had been fundamentally broken. It did not die, it did not wither. It stood, still radiant, still beautiful, but its light was now a fraction of what it had been, like a candle flame where a bonfire had once roared. The golden age of elven magic, an era defined by effortless abundance, impossible grace and power, so vast it felt infinite, ended not with a cataclysm, but with a quiet, permanent diminishment. The song of the world was still there, but it was now a softer, simpler melody, played on fewer strings. In the days that followed, the reality of this new existence settled over the realms like a fine, gentle ash. Elves who had once woven spells of breathtaking complexity now found their power capped, their abilities reduced to more practical, grounded levels. The spires of the capital, which had glowed with an internal light, now required enchanted lanterns. The healing fountains worked, but their powers were slower, requiring more rest and recuperation. The effortless flight that had been a birthright was now a skill only the most powerful could manage, and even then, only for short distances. It was not a loss of magic, but a loss of its limitless potential. The world had not ended, it had become ordinary. The unparalleled beauty that had been the defining characteristic of their civilization had given way to something sturdier, something earned, resilience. This new, quieter world presented Elowen with a leadership challenge far more complex than any battle strategy. She was no longer a rebel or a war hero. She was the steward of a convalescent patient. How does one lead a people through not a recovery, but an adjustment? Does she focus their efforts on trying to rediscover the old glory, to pour their diminished resources into a futile attempt to rekindle a flame that cannot be reignited? Or does she guide them to fully embrace this new, simpler reality, to find pride not in what they had lost, but in what they could still build with what remained? Her every word, her every decision, would set the cultural tone for centuries to come. Would she become a leader who spoke only of nostalgic grandeur, forever reminding them of the paradise that was? Or would she become the architect of a new, more humble identity, one built on cooperation, practicality, and the strength found in community rather than in individual power. The temptation to mourn was overwhelming. She felt it herself, a constant low ache for the vibrant, thrumming connection to magic that had been a part of her since birth. She saw it in the faces of the older generation, who moved through the dimmer streets with a palpable sense of grief. But she also saw something else, something that gave her a direction. She saw young elves who had only known a world of crisis and diminishment, looking at the challenges not with despair, but with a determined curiosity. They weren't trying to rebuild the floating gardens of the past. They were figuring out new, ingenious ways to irrigate the ground-level ones with their limited magic. They were innovators, not restorers. Their strength would not be in preserving a faded memory, but in adapting to a new truth. This realization became her compass. Her leadership would not be about managing loss, but about curating adaptation. She began to speak not of the glorious past, but of the practical future. She redirected the remaining magical scholars from theoretical studies of lost high magic to applied studies of efficient enchantment and sustainable resource management. She praised the carpenter who devised a better pulley system as highly as she once would have praised a master of elemental magic. The theme of her new rule was not perfection, but perseverance. The beauty of the elven people was no longer in their flawless, glittering spires, but in the determined hands that repaired a cracked wall, in the patient voices that resolved a dispute without the crutch of pacifying magic, in the communities that learned to rely on each other's skills instead of taking endless magical abundance for granted. The golden age was over, but a new age was beginning, one that would be written not in light, but in the stronger, more enduring ink of resilience and hard-won unity. The title of steward was not a coronation. It was a commission to rebuild a collapsed bridge over a raging river, with no blueprint and only the most fragile of materials to work with. There was no grand ceremony in the sunstone spire, no glittering crown placed upon Elowen's head. Instead, she stood in the central plaza of the capital, still scarred by the recent fighting, and addressed a crowd of elves whose faces were a mosaic of grief, suspicion, and a fragile, hesitant hope. Her authority was not inherited or seized. It was bestowed upon her by the collective, exhausted will of a people who had run out of other options. She was not their queen, and she made that clear from the very first moment. She was their facilitator, their guide, and in many ways, their most determined laborer. Her first act as steward was one of brutal, unprecedented transparency. She ordered the creation of a great, public ledger, etched onto magically treated stone tablets in the main square for all to see. In it, she recorded everything. The remaining reserves of magical energy, now a fraction of what they once were, the stocks of food and medicine, the detailed damage reports from every district and every breakaway region that agreed to communicate. This was a radical departure from the old ways, where the court had managed information like a precious commodity, often masking shortages and problems behind a veil of serene perfection. Elowen believed that trust could not be requested. It had to be built, and its only foundation was unvarnished truth. She forced everyone to look directly at the scale of the ruin they inhabited, to understand the precise dimensions of the challenge before them. There would be no more beautiful lies. This transparency became the bedrock for her reforms, all of which were built on the principle of shared responsibility. Under the old system, the central court had dictated, and the outlying regions had obeyed. That model lay in ashes. Elowen established a new council, but it bore no resemblance to King Theron's assembly of esteemed elites. This was a circular table, and its seats were reserved for representatives from every corner of the fractured realms, from the loyalist strongholds to the secessionist states, to the former members of the Verdant Veil who had laid down their arms. It was a chaotic, often contentious body, filled with voices that had been shouting at each other for months. Her role was not to command them, but to moderate them, to tirelessly guide the conversation away from blame and toward solutions. Her greatest challenge was balancing the necessary authority of her position with a genuine, practiced humility. There were moments that demanded swift, unilateral decisions, like dispatching aid to a region on the brink of famine, or deploying peacekeepers to a border dispute, threatening to flare into violence. She had to wield that power decisively, knowing that hesitation could cost lives. Yet, in the very next moment, she might be on her knees in a field alongside farmers from a formerly secessionist territory, learning their new, non-magical irrigation techniques and asking for their advice. She made a point of never using the residual magic she still possessed for tasks that could be done by hand, demonstrating that their new world did not have a separate class of beings who were above manual labor. She listened far more than she spoke, especially to those who disagreed with her, understanding that the only way to weave a new tapestry was to use every thread, even the frayed and discordant ones. This painful, meticulous process forced the elves to learn a new way of being. The thriving they had known before was a passive experience. It was the thriving of a plant in perfect sunlight, given endless water and ideal conditions. The thriving they had to learn now was active. It was the thriving of a hardy root, finding purchase in cracked stone, of a community sharing meager resources to ensure no one starved. They discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. Artisans who once crafted exquisite jewelry with delicate spells now applied that same precision to forging stronger plowshares and mending broken walls. Scholars whose lives were dedicated to theoretical magic now turned their brilliant minds to engineering, architecture, and agriculture. Their achievements measured not in the grandeur of their spells, but in the durability of their designs and the yield of their crops. From this grueling, unglamorous work, hope did not arrive as a sudden blast of sunlight. It emerged slowly, like the first green shoots after a fire, fragile but tenacious. It was present in the quiet satisfaction of a shared meal after a long day of rebuilding a bridge. It was heard in the laughter that finally returned to the public squares, not carefree as it once was, but deeper, earned through shared struggle. It was seen in the way a former loyalist guard would now nod in respect to a former Veil member, not because they had resolved their differences, but because they had spent a week together, shoring up a collapsing reservoir wall, and had developed a mutual respect for each other's stubborn perseverance. The hope that emerged from the ruins was not a promise that everything would be perfect again. It was the proven fact that they could face imperfection together, and that there was a different kind of beauty to be found not in flawless gems and glowing spires, but in the strong, reliable grip of a helping hand. The journey to the Silverwood Marches was different this time. Elowen did not travel in secret, nor was she accompanied by a single, trusted ally. She walked openly, her steps measured and deliberate, a small retinue of her newly formed stewardship guard, maintaining a respectful distance. The air, once thick with the vibrant hum of magic, was now still and thin, carrying the faint, sweet, and sour scent of loss. The road itself told the story of their new reality, where enchantments had once seamlessly mended cracks and guided travelers. Now physical markers and hand-painted signs pointed the way, a testament to a world learning to function without endless, effortless power. When she reached the heart of the Silverwood, the sight was both familiar and newly heartbreaking. The great moon willows still stood, but they were ghosts of their former selves. Their silver bark was dull and brittle, their famous leaves mostly fallen, creating a carpet of gray dust that crunched softly underfoot. This was not the violent aftermath of a battle. It was a quiet, pervasive fading. The grove had become a living memorial, a physical scar on the land that perfectly mirrored the invisible ones carried by every elf. It was a place of profound silence, not the peaceful quiet of a forest, but the hollow silence of an interrupted song. Elowen did not try to use magic to sense the decay. She simply stood there, allowing the weight of the loss to settle upon her. This was the cost. This was the price of their survival, written not in blood, but in blight. It was here, amidst the symbols of what could never be restored, that they came to meet her. She had not summoned them with a formal decree, but had simply announced her journey, an open invitation carried by word of mouth and the new, slower networks of communication. They emerged from the tree line not as a hostile force, but as hesitant figures, a handful of former Verdant Veil members, their postures tense, their faces a mixture of defiance, shame, and a desperate, fragile hope. Their leader was not a fiery revolutionary, but a woman named Reese, a master horticulturist whose frustration with the court's hoarding of growth, enhancing magic, had made her an early and passionate convert to the Veil's cause. She had not planted bombs, she had redirected irrigation spells, believing she was watering the seeds of a new, more equitable world. The confrontation was not one of words, but of shared presence. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the gray clearing, the stewards of the new order and the architects of the unraveling. Elowen saw not monsters, but mirrors or reflections of her own past frustration, her own doubts about the system, her own willingness to step outside the lines for what she believed was right. The difference was not in their love for the Elven people, but in the catastrophic methods that love had justified. Reese was the first to speak, her voice rough, as if from disuse. "We did not think it would end like this," she said, her gaze sweeping over the withered grove. "We saw a system that was suffocating itself in its own beauty. We thought a controlled burn would yield stronger regrowth. We never intended this total desolation." Her words were not an excuse. They were a confession offered to the land itself. Another former Veil member, a young cartographer named Fen, added quietly, "The world you are building, the ledgers, the shared councils, it is what many of us wanted. We just could not see a path to it without first tearing the old one down." Elowen listened, and in their admissions, she heard the blueprint for a terrifyingly difficult, but essential, next step. To exclude them would be to forever treat a symptom instead of the disease. It would create a permanent underclass of the disillusioned, ensuring the ideals of the Veil would fester in the shadows, waiting for the next moment of weakness to bloom again. But to include them was to invite the fox into the henhouse, to risk legitimizing their destructive methods and betraying those who had suffered from them. Her growth was measured in the space between that fear and a greater understanding. The skeptic who had once seen the world in clear divisions of loyalist and traitor was gone. In her place stood a unifier who understood that true peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice that acknowledges complex truths. Her decision was made there, among the dead trees. She would not grant them amnesty, she would grant them responsibility. The silverwood is a witness to our failure, Elowen said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. It will also be the first witness to our reconciliation. I am forming a new council, not of the flawless, but of the invested. Its purpose will be restoration, and its membership will include voices from every corner of this conflict, including yours. You will have a seat, not as a reward, but as a duty. You will help us heal the land you helped wound. Your expertise in growth and mapping will be turned to these groves first. You will look upon this blight every day and remember the cost of your ideals, and we will watch you, not with trust, but with the hope that it can be earned. The council she established was her most radical act yet. It was a deliberate, uncomfortable weaving of opposites. Former Veil sat alongside border lords who had lost kin to their indirect actions. Royal archivists debated with grassroots organizers. The tensions were not hidden, they were the very engine of the council's work. Disagreements were not smoothed over with polite magic. They were argued out, sometimes loudly and painfully, in full view of the public ledgers. It was messy, inefficient, and often felt on the brink of flying apart. But it was real. It was a structure that acknowledged the simmering tensions instead of pretending they didn't exist, forcing former enemies to solve practical problems together, building a new kind of trust, brick by painful brick. Peace was not guaranteed. It was a fragile, living thing that required constant attention and the courage to embrace uncomfortable complexity. But for the first time, it was not just a hope. It was a project they were all building together. The memorial was not built of marble or enchanted crystal. Elowen knew that such materials spoke of a perfection they could no longer claim and a permanence they had learned to distrust. Instead, she chose living wood from the recovering silverwood and stone hauled from the riverbanks by volunteers. It stood in the main square, not as a towering monument, but as a quiet, circular gathering place. At its center was not a statue of a hero, but a simple, open book, carved from a single block of obsidian, its pages forever blank. This, she explained to the gathered crowd on the day of its dedication, was the point. The story of their fall was not a finished tale to be carved in stone and admired. It was a living narrative that they were all still writing together. And the blank pages were a promise that the next chapters could be different if they chose to remember the ones that came before. The names were not inscribed on the monument itself. Instead, they were spoken. Elowen began with Kalin, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the silent crowd. She did not list his titles or his final, glorious sacrifice. She spoke of his exile, his loneliness, and his stubborn, unyielding dedication to truths that were uncomfortable. She spoke of the archivist, not the martyr. Then she called upon others. A soldier stepped forward and spoke the name of a fallen comrade, not as a loyalist or a rebel, but simply as a friend. A mother spoke the name of her child, lost in the chaos of the capital's streets. A former member of the Verdant Veil, their head bowed, spoke the name of a fellow idealist who had lost their way in the pursuit of a purer world. The memorial was not a list of the dead. It was a tapestry of loss woven from the voices of the living, a ritual that forced acknowledgement of the complex, messy cost of their conflict. It made the past present, and in doing so, made it impossible to ignore. This act of communal remembrance was the key that unlocked the second part of Kalin's legacy, his archives. Elowen did not move the fragile scrolls and texts to a pristine, restricted library in the Sunstone Spire. She had them carefully copied by teams of scribes, a painstaking process that itself became a form of meditation on the words being transcribed. These copies were then placed in new learning halls built in every major settlement, spaces that were open to all, regardless of status or background. The curriculum was not focused on the glorious battles and flawless kings of the old histories. It was built around Kalin's heretical texts, the accounts of failed harvests the court had covered up, the ignored petitions from the border regions, the philosophical debates where dissenting voices were silenced for the sake of harmony. Students were not taught what to think, but how to question. They studied the Verdant Veil's manifestos alongside the royal decrees that had provoked them, not to judge which was right, but to understand how each side's certainties had led them to catastrophe. This relentless focus on uncomfortable truth sparked a profound cultural shift. The old elven virtue of Sildoria, often translated as graceful silence or keeping the peace, began to be re-examined. Where it had once been praised as a noble act of avoiding conflict, the new generation started to see it as it often was, a cowardly act of avoidance, a choice to prioritize pleasant fiction over difficult fact. A new term entered the common language, Andoria, or truth-speaking. It was not about brutal honesty or accusation, but about the courageous and compassionate act of naming problems aloud before they could fester in the dark. Parents found their children questioning family traditions that no longer served a purpose. Artisans openly debated the flaws in each other's designs, not as criticism, but in a collective pursuit of improvement. The cultural obsession with flawless beauty gave way to a deep appreciation for the beauty of a thing well mended, for the visible repair that proved its resilience in history. This transformation escalated Elowen's role from a political steward to something far more profound, a keeper of history. She was no longer just managing resources and mediating disputes. She was the chief architect of the new Elven identity, and her primary tool was the unvarnished past. She spent less time in the council chamber and more time in the learning halls, not as a lecturer, but as a discussion leader, guiding young elves through the complex lessons of their recent history. Her authority was no longer rooted in her magical power, which was still diminished, but in her unwavering commitment to this difficult truth. She became the living bridge between the world that was and the world that was becoming, the one person who had seen both the gilded cage of their perfection and the brutal cost of smashing it, and who could articulate a third path. The past, under her careful stewardship, ceased to be a weapon to bludgeon opponents or a golden age to be mourned. It became their most essential guide. Every policy proposal, every new initiative was held up against the light of recent history. Would this decision repeat the mistakes of the old court, centralizing power and ignoring the periphery. Does this new trade agreement risk creating the same resentments that festered in the Silverwood marches? The memorial's blank stone book was a constant reminder that they were responsible for what came next, and that the only way to write a better future was to have the courage to read their past, page by painful page, and learn its lessons well. The first hint was not a shout, but a whisper so faint it was almost a memory. Elowen was in one of the new learning halls, listening to a group of young apprentices debate the hydrological theories in Kalin's archived scrolls, when she felt it. It was not a physical sensation, but a sudden, subtle dissonance in the background hum of the world, like a single instrument in a vast orchestra, playing a fraction of a note out of key. It was the same unique, chilling silence she had felt in the roots of the Lumina Tree a lifetime ago, but now it was impossibly distant, a ghost of a ghost. Her own magical senses, though permanently diminished from their former peak, were still finely attuned to the specific frequency of the weeping's corruption. This was not a new attack, it was an echo, a faint, residual tremor from a wound they had believed was closed. She excused herself calmly, her face a mask of the serene focus the apprentices had come to expect from their steward. But inside, a cold dread, so familiar and yet so unwelcome, began to uncoil. She retreated to her private study, a room that held not the opulence of a ruler, but the practical tools of a researcher: maps, ledgers, and a simple scrying basin. For hours, she pored over the updated magical survey reports from the remotest regions of the fractured realms. The data was sparse. Their capacity for wide area magical monitoring was a shadow of what it had been. Finally, she found it, a single, anomalous reading from the furthest eastern reach of the Whispering Glens, a place of mist-shrouded valleys and deep, forgotten caves where few elves ever ventured. The energy signature was minuscule, a flicker so weak any other mage would have dismissed it as a natural fluctuation or a glitch in the rudimentary detection network. But Elowen knew it was the signature of the heart of Ethelgard's corruption. A tendril of the sickness had survived. It had not been eradicated, only scattered, and somewhere in that isolated wilderness, a seed of it had found purchase and was beginning, slowly, to regrow. The decision that lay before her was a perfect measure of how far she had come. The Elowen of old, the solitary high mage, would have immediately sounded the alarm. She would have gone directly to the council, presented the terrifying evidence, and mobilized every resource for a swift, overwhelming response. But the Elowen of now, the steward who had learned the brutal cost of panic and the delicate art of building trust, hesitated. She looked at the fragile peace they had built. She thought of the former Verdant Veil members on her council, like Reese, who were only just beginning to believe in a system that treated them with respect instead of suspicion. She thought of the common folk in the streets, who finally slept through the night without fear, their dreams no longer haunted by the green-tinged nightmares of the uprising. To announce this now, to declare that the monster they had all fought so hard to slay might still be breathing, would be to drop a stone into the still waters of their hard-won stability. It could shatter everything. It would ignite old fears, fuel new conspiracy theories, and give the remaining hardliners in every faction the ammunition they needed to argue for a return to militancy and mistrust. Her choice, therefore, was not one of action, but of approach, She would not rally the guards or convene an emergency session. Instead, she would go herself. Alone, or with one or two of the most trusted rangers from her personal guard. She would treat this not as a crisis, but as an investigation. This quiet, deliberate response was the ultimate proof of her evolved leadership. It was a statement that the steward's primary duty was not just to protect the realm from external threats, but to safeguard the fragile spirit of its people. She would not be the leader who cried wolf and risked unraveling their social fabric for a threat that might still be contained. She would be the sentinel on the wall, the watchful eye that spots a distant smudge on the horizon and moves to identify it before raising the alarm. This was vigilance. It was a quieter, lonelier, and far more burdensome duty than command, because it required her to hold the weight of a potential catastrophe entirely by herself, to project calm while her every instinct screamed of danger. Yet, for all its wisdom, this decision could not erase the underlying tension. It simply internalized it, shifting the weight from the public sphere onto her own shoulders. The threat, however small, was real. The corruption had proven itself to be not just a force, but a resilient, almost intelligent presence, capable of hiding and biding its time. Her quiet investigation was a gamble. Every day she spent traveling to the Whispering Glens. Every hour she spent searching for the source of the echo was a day the potential infection could grow stronger, undetected and unchallenged. She was betting her own skill and the head start of her early detection against the exponential growth of a magic that had already nearly destroyed their world. It raised a terrifying question that would hang over her journey like a shroud. Was her commitment to peace causing her to underestimate the enemy yet again? Or was this the only way to truly protect a people who had already endured enough fear to last 1,000 years? The path of the steward was no longer paved with clear victories. It was a narrow, winding trail through a field of hidden dangers, where the greatest leadership was often shown not in the battles you chose to fight, but in the terrors you chose to face alone. The faint echo of corruption in the Whispering Glens was a chilling reminder that their hard-won peace was not a permanent state, but a condition that required constant, vigilant care. Elowen's quiet investigation had confirmed her fears. A minuscule shard of the Weeping's malice had survived, hidden in a place of profound isolation. She had contained it, a task that required more cunning than power, but the experience left her with a profound realization. They could not simply react to threats as they emerged, scrambling to put out fires. They needed a new kind of sentinel, one designed not for a war of obvious enemies, but for the quiet, patient work of preventative guardianship. This vision gave birth to the Sentinels of the Unbroken Circle, an order unlike any the Elven realms had ever known. Its founding principle was a radical departure from the old guard of the Sunstone Spire. Membership was not based on bloodline, proven power, or loyalty to the crown. The only requirements were a keen sensitivity to magical currents and an unwavering commitment to the realm's health above any regional or factional allegiance. Elowen herself traveled to every corner of the fractured kingdoms, from the still recovering Silverwood marches to the independent sun-kissed reaches, personally inviting the first recruits. A young, sharp-eyed ranger from the borderlands who could sense a ley line fluctuation through the feel of the soil under her feet was given a rank equal to a former high mage from the capital whose power was diminished, but whose knowledge was deep. A former Veil sympathizer, a brilliant theorist who had once redirected energy for destructive ends, now found a sanctioned outlet for his precise skills in monitoring the flow of magic. The Circle's ranks became a living tapestry of the new elven world, woven from threads that had once been bitterly opposed. This deliberate diversity was its greatest strength and its most constant challenge. The Circle's headquarters, established in a neutral, repurposed way station at the crossroads of three formerly hostile regions, was a perpetual experiment in collaboration. Disputes were not merely professional, they were deeply personal, echoes of the recent war. A scout from the Glens might bristle at taking orders from a mage whose accent marked her as from the capital, a place he still blamed for his family's suffering. A loyalist spell weaver might distrust the date brought to her by a ranger who had once worn the leaf pin of the Verdant Veil. Elowen found her role as steward evolving into that of a full-time mediator, her days spent not in a throne room, but in the common hall of the way station, listening to grievances, facilitating difficult conversations, and tirelessly reminding them of their shared purpose. She had to be a translator of not just languages, but of wounds, helping each side understand the fears and prejudices that fueled the other's stubbornness. Yet, from this friction, a remarkable new strength began to emerge, forced to work together on long patrols through the misty valleys, or during all-night monitoring sessions at remote outposts. These elves from different worlds began to see each other not as symbols of a past conflict, but as individuals. The capital mage learned that the border rangers' superstitions about the land were actually a sophisticated, intuitive understanding of magical ecosystems that her academic training had never covered. The ranger, in turn, saw the mage's precise calculations not as arrogance, but as a necessary tool that could predict a magical drought before the crops failed. They discovered that their different approaches were not weaknesses, but complementary skills. A potential dispute over resource allocation in the marches was solved not by a decree from the capital, but by a joint team from the Circle, a local who knew the land and a strategist from the Whispering Glens who devised a solution that was both efficient and culturally respectful. Cooperation was slowly, painstakingly, replacing the instinct for conflict because it was proving to be more effective. Elowen's commitment to this unity was no longer a political strategy. It had become her life's work, an all-consuming dedication that escalated with every small success and every setback. She understood that the unbroken circle was more than an early warning system. It was the living, breathing embodiment of the future she was trying to build. Its very existence was a statement that their safety depended not on walls and isolation, but on connection and mutual understanding. Every resolved argument within its ranks, every joint mission that ended without incident, was a victory far greater than any battlefield triumph. It was the proof that the different pieces of their broken world could not only coexist, but could fit together to form something new, something stronger and more resilient than the flawless, solitary jewel of the past. The Circle's work was never done, its harmony never perfect, but in its constant, earnest effort, Elowen saw the best possible answer to the silent, corrosive whisper of division. Standing on a balcony overlooking the city, she now served as steward. Elowen watched the slow, deliberate work of stonemasons, repairing a wall that had been shattered during the uprising. Their progress was methodical, unglamorous, a world away from the effortless magic that would have once woven the structure back together in the blink of an eye. This site, once a symbol of everything they had lost, now felt different. It was no longer a reminder of diminishment, but a testament to perseverance. In the quiet of the evening, with the sounds of honest labor rising from below, she allowed herself a moment of reflection to trace the painful, winding path that had led them all here. The fall of the Elven Kingdoms was not a single event, but a slow unraveling, a process of shedding an identity that had become too rigid, too beautiful, and too fragile to survive the complexities of the real world. She had fought so desperately to prevent that fall, to preserve the glorious perfection she had been sworn to protect. Now, with the clarity of hindsight, she understood that her greatest failure had been in misunderstanding the very nature of strength. The lesson was written not in the history scrolls, but in the calluses on the hands of the builders below, in the shared meals of former enemies on her council, in the quiet hum of the Lumina Tree that was no longer a roar of infinite power, but a steady, reliable heartbeat. True strength was not the absence of flaw or the endless abundance of magic. It was the courage to adapt, the wisdom to bend rather than break, and the resilience to find a new way forward when the old one had collapsed. The pristine, unchanging beauty of the Golden Age had been a magnificent painting, but it was a painting behind glass static, untouchable, and ultimately lifeless. What was growing in its place was a living garden, wild and unpredictable, filled with both thorns and unexpected blossoms, but it was undeniably, vibrantly alive. This acceptance was the price of her wisdom, paid for in grief, in conflict, and in the life of a friend. It was the understanding that some things, once broken, cannot be made whole again in their original form. The Lumina Tree would never glow with its former blinding radiance. The effortless grace of high magic was a chapter that had closed. To spend her days mourning, that loss would be to dishonor the struggle that had given them this new chance. This emotional shift was the core of her resolve. Her leadership was no longer fueled by a desperate desire to restore a faded past, but by a fierce determination to nurture the promising, if imperfect, present. She saw the evidence of this deeper strength everywhere she looked. The new generation of elves, those who had come of age during the strife or after the diminishment, possessed a practicality and a creativity that their ancestors would have found bewildering. They weren't lamenting the loss of floating cities. They were designing ingenious systems of pulleys and levees that were in their own way just as marvelous. The art that was emerging was different, less about idealized forms and more about raw emotion, capturing the spectrum of their experience, from despair to hope. The music was richer, incorporating dissonant chords and complex rhythms that told the story of their recovery. The beauty that was emerging was earned, a beauty of character and effort, and in her eyes, it was infinitely more valuable than the effortless perfection of before. This reflection solidified her purpose, hardening her resolve into something as durable as the stone being laid in the streets below. The journey had stripped away her illusions, but in their place, it had given her a far more powerful gift, a clear-eyed vision of what truly mattered. It was not about building a new kingdom that would stand forever unchanging, but about fostering a people who could withstand change. It was about valuing the hands that repaired the wall more than the spell that could have built it. Her own growth was mirrored in the realms. She was no longer the isolated high mage in her spire, fearing the slightest flaw. She was the steward walking among her people, her authority rooted not in her power, but in her shared experience of their struggle and her unwavering belief in their collective ability to grow through it. The loss was profound and permanent, a quiet ache that would always be with her, but it was also the fertile ground from which all their new beginnings had sprung. The fall had not been an ending. It had been the difficult, necessary birth of something more resilient, more compassionate, and more truly wise. The air in the great plaza was still, holding a quality of collective breath. It was the annual remembrance, a ceremony that had once been a somber honoring of ancient, mythic heroes from wars so distant they felt like stories. This year, it was different. The names spoken into the hushed twilight were not from legends. They were the names of neighbors, of friends, of the archivist who had once been scorned. The blank-paged obsidian book at the center of the memorial seemed to absorb the grief and the love in equal measure, a silent witness to a pain that was still fresh and real. When Elowen stepped forward to speak, she did not climb onto a raised dais. She stood on the same level as everyone else, her simple steward's robes a stark contrast to the ornate garments of ceremonies past. Her voice, when it came, carried not by amplification magic, but by the profound silence of a people waiting for a sign. She did not speak of restoring the lost glory. She did not weave visions of spires regaining their impossible light, or of magic flowing once more with endless, thoughtless abundance. Instead, she spoke of the wall that had been repaired by hand in the artisan's district, its new stones a testament to patience and skill. She spoke of the shared meal between former rivals in the Silverwood, where the conversation was awkward, but the bread was broken together. "We have spent so long mourning the light that faded," she said, her gaze sweeping over the faces of old and young alike, "that we risk missing the new kinds of light being kindled all around us. They are quieter, perhaps. They require more effort to see, but they are no less brilliant." Then she made her vow, not to the memory of a king or the symbol of a tree, but to the people standing before her. "I vow to protect these realms not as a memory of what they were, but as a promise of what they are and what they are becoming. I will serve the living truth, not a faded dream." Our strength is no longer in our perfection, but in our perseverance. Our beauty is no longer in our flawlessness, but in our mended cracks. The consequence of this vow was not a political decree. It was an emotional earthquake that reshaped the very landscape of hope for those listening. For the older generation, it was a permission to finally, truly, let go of a past that had become a burden, to release the guilt of having failed to preserve it. For the young, those who had only known a world of struggle and adaptation, it was a validation. Their practical innovations, their blunt questions, their willingness to get their hands dirty, these were not compromises. They were the new pillars of their civilization. Elowen was not just leading them, she was naming the value of the world they were already building. In that moment, she became more than a steward. She became a mirror, showing them their own collective strength reflected back at them. This act secured her legacy in the most profound way possible. It ceased to be about her individual achievements, the discoveries she had made, the battles she had won. Her legacy became inextricably woven into the identity of the next generation of leaders, now emerging from the learning halls and the sentinel circles. These were young elves who led with empathy, born from studying their history's failures, who valued collaboration over command, and who saw diversity of thought not as a threat to unity, but as its essential ingredient. They were her living legacy, the embodiment of her vow, and their rise was the surest sign that the quiet wars of ideology and division had truly ended. The challenges, of course, remained. There would always be border disputes, resource shortages, and the stubborn embers of old hatreds that needed careful tending to ensure they never burst into flame again. But the pervasive shadow of existential dread had lifted. The hope that now flourished was not a fragile thing. It was a resilient, hardy plant. Its roots sunk deep into the hard-won wisdom of a people who had learned to embrace change, not fear it. Elowen's greatest triumph was not in saving a dying world, but in teaching everyone how to love the new one that had been born from its ashes. The air in the central plaza was thick with a quiet, collective reverence, a feeling that seemed to muffle the usual sounds of the recovering city. In the center of the gathering, a simple patch of earth had been prepared, free of stone or artifice. Elowen stood before it, and in her hands, she cradled not a glittering artifact or a powerful relic, but a single, unassuming seed. It was smaller than one might expect, its surface a dull, woody brown, yet it seemed to hold the weight of all their history within its compact form. This was the last seed of the great Lumina Tree, a final, precious echo of the Golden Age, saved from the withering parent not by magic, but by the quick, desperate hands of a groundskeeper on the day the spire had cracked. For months, Elowen had guarded it, a secret hope she carried with her, unsure if it would ever find its time to be planted. Today felt like that time. Her actions were not those of a high mage performing a grand ritual. They were the slow, deliberate movements of a gardener. She knelt in the rich soil, the simple act of her knees meeting the ground, feeling more significant than any throne she had ever approached. With her bare hands, she dug a small hole, the cool earth a tangible connection to the realm she served. There was no spell to ensure its growth, no enchantment to guarantee its strength. There was only the act itself, the careful placement of the seed, the gentle pressing of soil around it, the handful of water offered from a simple clay pitcher. This was not a ceremony of power, but one of faith. The seed, like their future, would have to find its own way to grow, guided by sunlight and rain and care, not forced by will alone. As she rose, wiping the earth from her hands, she did not address the crowd with a speech about destiny or renewal. Instead, she simply turned to them, her gaze sweeping over the faces of former loyalists, former Veil members, artisans, farmers, and sentinels. "It is planted," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the hushed air. "But a seed is only a promise. It cannot water itself. It cannot shield itself from the storm. It cannot ensure its own roots find the nourishment they need." She then did the one thing that felt more vulnerable than any battle she had ever fought. She stepped back. She physically moved away from the tiny mound of earth, creating a space between herself and the symbol of their future. "This does not belong to me. It belongs to all of us. Its care cannot be my duty alone." The consequence of this simple act was a shift in the very atmosphere of the plaza. A palpable transfer of responsibility flowed from her into the crowd. For so long, they had looked to her, to the steward, to the hero, to the figure who had faced the darkness, to lead and to fix and to save. Now she was explicitly, visibly, handing a piece of that salvation back to them. An elderly elven woman, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of weaving, was the first to step forward. Without a word, she placed a small, protective ward of woven grasses around the planting site, a humble charm of blessing. A burly stone mason from the marches followed, pledging to craft a low, beautiful wall to protect the sapling from being trampled, not to cage it, but to give it space to grow. A former Veil botanist, her eyes still shadowed by past choices, offered her expertise in monitoring the soil's health. One by one, elves from every faction and walk of life came forward, not to swear fealty to Elowen, but to make a personal commitment to this one small, collective hope. This was the full circle of the story, the closing of a loop that had begun with a single mage investigating a rot she was told to ignore. That journey had been one of isolation, of bearing terrible secrets alone, of making impossible choices in the shadows. It had been necessary, but it was not sustainable. The true healing, the genuine regrowth, could not be accomplished by one person, no matter how wise or powerful. It required the shared effort of the entire community, each person offering their unique skill, their unique care. Elowen, by planting the seed and stepping away, was finally practicing the deepest form of trust she had ever had to learn, trust in others. She was accepting that the future of the realms would be shaped not by her vision alone, but by the combined hands of everyone who called it home. The tiny seed in the ground was a symbol, yes, but it was also a test. Its growth would be slow, requiring patience and consistent, shared effort. Its success would be their success. Its failure, should it come, would be a failure of their collective will. In that small patch of earth, they were not planting a tree. They were planting a new way of being, a living reminder that the most important things are never accomplished alone, but are nurtured into being together. The final stone was set in the new learning hall, the scent of fresh ink and parchment, now as familiar in the city as the fading scent of magic. In a quiet room overlooking this hub of new ideas, Elowen sat before a stack of blank vellum, a simple quill in her hand. The task before her felt heavier than any artifact, more daunting than any battle. She was not to write a history of kings and battles, a chronicle of glorious victories. Her duty was to document the silence. She began to write the true story of the quiet wars, and with her first words, she named the enemy. It was not Arian. It was not the Verdant Veil. The true adversary, the corrosive force that had nearly unmade them, had been their own collective pride and their worship of silence. Her chronicle did not start with the discovery of the Decay in the Lumina Tree, but long before, in the countless small moments where truth had been sacrificed for the sake of a peaceful appearance. She wrote of petitions from the borderlands that were filed away unread because their concerns were deemed disruptive to the capital's serenity. She detailed the council meetings where advisors, fearing the king's displeasure, couched urgent warnings in such delicate language that they became meaningless. She gave a name to their old virtue, Sildoria, and redefined it not as graceful silence, but as a cowardly and complicit agreement to ignore growing fractures for the sake of maintaining a beautiful illusion. She wrote with the piercing clarity of one who had been both a perpetrator and a victim of this silence, detailing her own initial hesitation to speak up, her fear of causing panic, and how that single choice had set her on a path of solitary burden. The enemy, she concluded, was the part of every elf that valued a perfect lie over an imperfect truth. The consequence of this unflinching honesty was a text that felt less like a historical record and more like a mirror held up to the soul of every reader. When she presented the unseen bonds to the new council, the reaction was not immediate approval, but a profound, uncomfortable stillness. Here were their own failings, their own prejudices, and their own quiet compromises, laid bare without judgment, but also without excuse. There was no villain to blame, except the one they saw in their own reflections. After a long and somber debate, the council did not merely approve the text. They voted unanimously to make it the foundational volume in every learning hall across all the realms. It became required reading not as a punishment, but as a vaccine. Every young elf would now be inoculated with this difficult knowledge, taught from their earliest lessons that a community's health depends on its capacity for honest speech and its courage to listen to uncomfortable truths. This mandate escalated the process of cultural healing from a political effort into a deeply personal journey for every citizen. The book became a catalyst for conversations that had been stifled for generations. In taverns and town squares, elves found themselves discussing the lessons of the unseen bonds, applying its principles to their own lives. A merchant might admit to having once turned away a customer from the sun-kissed reaches out of old prejudice, and in doing so, would open a dialogue about trade and reconciliation. A parent might use its chapters to explain to their children why it's better to voice a fear aloud, even if your voice shakes, than to let it fester in the dark. The understanding it fostered was not a passive acceptance of history, but an active tool for navigating the present. By collectively staring at their shared failures without flinching, they robbed those failures of their power to secretly guide their actions. This radical honesty became their strongest shield against the past, the most effective way to ensure that the quiet wars of pride and silence could never again find fertile ground in which to grow. The Chronicle did not promise a perfect future, but it gave them the clear-eyed wisdom to build a resilient one, forever vigilant against the unseen enemy within. The path through the recovering forest was no longer a route of grim discovery, but a living testament to the quiet, stubborn will to mend. Elowen walked slowly, her boots sinking into the soft loam, the air filled not with the ominous silence of the weeping, but with the sounds of concentrated effort and low, cooperative voices. Here, in a grove that had been a monochrome wasteland of brittle branches, she saw a team of elves from regions that had, mere months ago, been on the brink of open war. A burly stone carver from the sun-kissed reaches, his arms dusted with gray rock powder, was carefully fitting a section of a repaired aqueduct, his movements guided by the precise instructions of a slender hydrologist from the Whispering Glens. Their collaboration was not a grand, ceremonial gesture of peace. It was a practical, shared focus on a single, vital task, their former loyalties irrelevant in the face of a common need for clean water. Further on, she paused by a circle of young apprentices, their faces smudged with soil, carefully tending to a patch of sun-starved saplings. They were not using the vast, sweeping spells of restoration that the high mages of old would have employed. Such power was a memory now. Instead, they worked with hands and with subtle, ground-level enchantments that required patience and precision, their magic a gentle, coaxing rather than a commanding force. One of them, a girl with the distinct accent of the Silverwood Marches, looked up and met Elowen's gaze, offering a shy but confident smile before returning to her work. There was no awe in her expression, no sense that she was in the presence of the legendary steward who had saved them. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a job being done well. And in that moment, Elowen felt the final, beautiful click of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. The realization washed over her with the gentle force of a rising tide. The fall of the unified Elven Kingdoms had not been a catastrophe to be reversed, but a necessary shattering. Like a seed pod bursting open, the old, rigid structure had fragmented to allow for new growth in every direction. They were not rebuilding the same realms. They were weaving something entirely new from the pieces, and the resulting tapestry was stronger specifically because of its diverse threads. The strength she saw here was not the towering, solitary strength of the ancient Lumina Tree, impressive but vulnerable to a single point of failure. This was the resilient, networked strength of a forest itself, a system of interconnected roots, where the weakness of one tree could be supported by the strength of its neighbors. The very conflicts that had torn them apart had forced them to develop unique skills and perspectives in isolation, and now those differences were becoming their greatest assets. This understanding settled into her bones, calm and certain. Her leadership, which had been so essential in the immediate aftermath, a steady hand on the tiller through the storm, was now becoming a potential obstacle. Her presence, her history, her very name, commanded a deference that could stifle the very innovation and grassroots collaboration she now witnessed. The new leaders they needed were not figureheads who remembered the old glory, but practical-minded problem solvers who had been forged in the challenges of the new world. They were the rangers coordinating border patrols with former rivals, the archivists developing new methods of storing knowledge without magical crystals, the community organizers who could mediate a dispute over land rights without needing a decree from the Sunstone Spire. They were already leading. They simply didn't need her to stand in front of them anymore. Her decision was not one of abdication, but of purposeful evolution. She would not vanish or retire. Such an abrupt departure would itself be a disruptive act. Instead, she would begin a gradual, deliberate process of stepping back. At the next council meeting, she would propose a rotation for the chair position, ensuring that representatives from every region took turns guiding the discourse. She would delegate more authority to the sentinels of the unbroken circle, empowering them to make independent judgments without seeking her approval. She would spend less time issuing directives and more time in the learning halls, listening to the debates of the young elves who were dissecting their history with a fearless clarity her generation had never possessed. She would make herself a resource, not a ruler. The hope that flickered in this recovering forest was not a flame she needed to carry herself. It was a fire that was catching on its own, and her final, most important duty was to carefully move away from the hearth, trusting the community to tend it themselves. The view from the Sunstone Spire was utterly transformed. Once a lonely perch for a solitary guardian, the height now felt like the heart of a great, breathing organism. Elowen stood not in isolation, but as a single point in a vast, interconnected web. Below her, the first lanterns of the evening were being lit not by magic, but by hand, their warm, flickering glow dotting the city like a constellation fallen to earth. The sunset painted the sky in hues of deep orange and soft purple, not a dramatic finale, but a gentle closing of a day filled with ordinary, precious labor. She watched as a group of sentinels, their uniforms a mix of styles from different regions, finished their shift at the western gate, sharing a laugh and a story before parting ways for the night. This was the piece they had won. It was not the pristine, silent piece of a painting. It was the lived-in, slightly messy piece of a home well loved, filled with the echoes of the day's work and the quiet promise of tomorrow. Her reflection was not a mourning for what was lost, but a quiet awe for what had been found in its place. The loss of their former glory had been a brutal, unforgiving teacher, but its lessons had revealed strengths they never knew they possessed. The blinding light of the Lumina Tree had hidden the subtle, resilient glow of individual spirit. When that great light dimmed, 1,000 smaller lights had begun to shine in the darkness. The stubborn courage of the border rangers, the quiet ingenuity of the artisans, the compassionate wisdom of the healers, and even the fierce, misguided passion of those who had believed destruction was the only path to change. The bonds between them were not the effortless harmony of a single, perfect note, but the rich, complex harmony of a choir of distinct voices, each with its own timbre and tone, learning to listen and blend. The fall of the kingdom had shattered the beautiful, brittle crystal of their old society, and from those fragments they had painstakingly built a mosaic, its beauty lying in its intricate, joined pieces, each one essential to the whole. They would never again command the effortless magic to make flowers bloom with a thought or spires gleam without a touch. The forests of the silverwood would always bear the silvery gray scars of the weeping, a permanent reminder of the price of silence. But in that diminishment, they had discovered a different, more profound kind of power. It was the power of a shared meal after a long day rebuilding a wall, the power of a difficult truth spoken aloud in a council meeting, the power of a hand offered in trust to a former enemy. Their beauty was no longer the untouchable beauty of a diamond under glass. It was the earned beauty of a well-worn tool, a sturdy piece of pottery, or a song whose lyrics spoke of both sorrow and hope. This new world was built not on the myth of perfection, but on the unshakable foundation of shared purpose and hard-won understanding. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, Elowen felt the weight of her legacy settle upon her, not as a burden, but as a quiet warmth. Her name would be remembered, yes, the steward who guided them through the breaking, but her true legacy was not etched in stone on a monument. It was written in the daily choices of the people below. It was in the young scribe teaching a former Veil member how to transcribe a text, in the shared water rights agreement between the sun-kissed reaches and the whispering glens, in the laughter of children who had never known a world without mended cracks, playing a game beneath the slowly growing sapling that had sprung from the last Lumina seed. She had not given them a perfect peace to inhabit, but the tools to build and rebuild their own peace, again and again, no matter what challenges the future might bring. The silence that fell over the city was no longer a fearful quiet, but the comfortable, watchful silence of a community at rest, united not by a crown or a tree, but by the resilient, enduring strength of a story they had chosen to continue.